Good evening all and welcome. The Mortis Media app is finally out for people on Android, and for everyone else on Apple, it will be out very soon. This is what it looks like. You can select the type of story you want, select the story itself, adjust the parameters within the app, and finally play around with the background music and sound effects. Level them, layer them. Play all the sound effects you want. Rain in this case, or any others that you want to throw in, you can do that. It's a lot of fun, and I would really appreciate it if you guys could download it, give me your honest feedback, and leave a review and a star rating. That's all I'm asking, and it would mean the absolute world to me. Tonight we're going to listen to how it would sound like on the app, with a selection of stories and, of course, some nice rain background to keep us busy. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Don't forget to download and leave that review, and let the darkness take control. This situation still gives me chills to this day. I lived in a sketchy part of the neighborhood, but I had never had a job outside other than helping my mum. So I was very naive and gullible at the time. I was out of high school and looking for work. I had worked with my mum junior to senior year cleaning houses, but I wanted to work somewhere else and gain some outside experience. When I had graduated high school, my mum and I decided it was time to look for another job because I needed some money for college. My mum loved to read newspapers, and we would get a Spanish newspaper called Mundo Hispánico every single week. I would look through it once in a while to read the comics or see job ads at the end. One evening, I was so determined to find an ad that paid well and was something else that would give me another set of working skills. I was going through the classified section at the end of the newspaper when I found what I thought to be the perfect job for me. I don't remember word for word, but it was something along the lines of looking for young females ages 18 to 25, for an open massage position at this location. Now, the location was 0.3 miles away from where I stayed, so I thought it was perfect. I could walk to and from without having to worry about transportation, since we only had one car. Massage training will be provided, and the pay is handsomely good. Our girls can earn anywhere from $500 to $900 a week. I thought, whoa, what a great wage. I can pay off my college in no time. I was so excited that I fit the profile, and I showed the job to my mum. My mum wasn't excited like I was, and she told me that it looked a tad suspicious, that I should call first to see if there really was another person on the other end. So I did, and a lady answered. I asked her about the free training, how much do you really make, and where the location was exactly. She seemed very sweet on the phone, and told me before we moved forward, they were doing interviews and already had other candidates on their list. She said that I could come in for an interview to see if I would make it to the second round. I agreed. She gave me the address and I looked it up. When I saw it was 0.3 miles from my apartment, I was so happy. I told my mum that I would be going to the interview at a set time, at this location and alone. She told me there was no way I would be going alone, and she would come with me. I was so mad because I wanted to do this by myself without having her help me, because in my little mind, I thought I was all grown up and didn't need help from her. The day came, and she drove us in the only car we had. Now, the address the lady gave near me was weird, because it took us to a motel behind the shopping plaza that was next to our apartment. It didn't make sense why they would have an interview there, so we just circled the plaza looking for the place. My mum became frustrated, and they told me they were in one of the motel rooms, and they were there because it was a safety precaution. It seemed to make sense to me at the time. I told her I could not find the place, so if she could please speak to my mother and tell her exactly where it was. "You're with your mother?" Her voice changed from a sweet, almost apologetic tone to an angry and panicky one. "Yeah, I am with her right now because she's driving me." So I passed the phone to my mum. She said, "Hello? Hello?" The lady had hung up on her. I called twice more, but she never picked up the phone. I was angry that the lady had just hung up, and so we went back home. I never put two and two together until about 3 years later, when I heard on the news that there was a newspaper job that had been busted, and the people were charged with trafficking. The ad was very similar to the one I had read years ago. I thanked my mum over and over, because if it wasn't for her, I could have been dead or trafficked multiple times. I don't know where I would have ended up. I'm so grateful for my mum, despite me being angry at her for coming with me, because if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be where I am today. This happened a few months ago. I'm a 24-year-old female and probably couldn't defend myself from a 10-year-old. I went to the grocery store to pick up some things the other night. When I got to the register, there was a man helping me bag my groceries while the cashier was checking me out. I was buying some dog treats, and he asked me what kind of dog I had. I said, "A golden doodle." And he said, "Oh my gosh, me too." I didn't really get an off vibe from him, but he would stare and not break eye contact at all. I chalked it up to him missing social cues and trying to be friendly. After I paid, he started pushing the cart for me out the door. This isn't uncommon, as they typically help you take your things to the car. I have social anxiety and feel very awkward and guilty for them having to do that for me, so I always tell them that I'm good and thank you. And every other time they've said, "Okay, have a good one." When I gave my usual reply to this guy, he said, "Nope, I got it," very bluntly, and stared at me the entire time. I instantly got a bad vibe from him. It was about 8 at night, and barely anyone was there. He said, "Well, my shift's over, so I'm walking to my car now anyway." Weird because he didn't clock out, but maybe he had before he did this last checkout. He was very talkative in the store, asking tons of questions about my dog and telling me about his, but when we got outside he barely said anything. I started asking questions about his dog, because I felt anxious with the silence, but I really regret that. He took it as an interest and immediately said, "Well, if you give me your number, you can meet him," and just stared yet again. "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't give my number to strangers. I don't want to say no because I have a boyfriend, because he seemed like he might get angry over that." When we loaded all the groceries in my trunk, I was thinking, thank goodness, I can get out of here now. But no. The cart was between me and him, and he was positioned on the driver's side, so in order to get to my door, I would have to go past him. "Well, I gotta get home. My dog's waiting for his treats." He just stared. I realized I was gonna have to go past him if I wanted to leave, so I looked around to see if anyone else was in the parking lot in case something more happened. No one. I started to get extremely nervous. He could push the cart into me or just grab me himself. I've had this traumatic experience before, and my problem is that I don't have a fight or flight. I just kind of freeze. Just like that, he starts walking away, pushing the car to where they are returned in the parking lot. I take the chance to get into the car and lock the doors immediately. I wish I left then, but I needed a moment to breathe, and I saw in my side mirror him getting into his car. I quickly put the car in drive and drove out. The exit is a stoplight, and just my luck it's red. I'm turning left. I see his car right behind mine not 30 seconds later. I panicked, but then I thought, he said he's going home. It's nothing. I only live 2 minutes from the grocery store. I made the turn, and he was hanging back. I didn't put my blinkers on for the next turn. He made it too. The next turn was a stoplight, and then the turn from my road. As I get to the light, it's red again. I thought maybe I should drive to a police station just in case. But as soon as that thought came in to my head, the light went green. My boyfriend and I only moved here 2 months ago, so I didn't think in my head how to get to the station, as I'm terrible at using my phone while driving, and I'm not even 30 seconds from the last turn onto our street. Our street is a dead end with only 4 houses on it. It's very long and we were at the end. No one goes down it unless they live there or are lost. I turn, and he makes the turn. I literally just directed him to my house. Thankfully, I have Bluetooth and called my boyfriend. I said, "A guy from the grocery store is following me. Turn on all the lights, open the gates, and let Nike out." Nike is his German Shepherd, and he was trained to be a German police dog, and then got extra bite training. He can hold someone for up to 6 hours. So now, knowing he was outside, I wasn't nervous. I was nervous that my boyfriend wouldn't have gotten the gate open in time, and I would have to either sit in my car or get out fast and put the code in. As I pulled in, I saw the gate was open, and my boyfriend was on the front porch with Nike on a leash, and has his firearm in the air. I fly through and down the driveway, and this guy follows. Does he not see the firearm and guard dog? Well, he did at that moment because my boyfriend let Nike go, and he charges the guy's car. He jumped up at the driver's window, frothing at the mouth, showing all his teeth, and the hair on the back standing up. He looked terrifying even to me, and he was protecting me. I gave Nike his command to come back, hoping this guy got the hint that if he gets out of the car, he's going to perish. And hint he got. He reversed the car so damn fast out the driveway he nearly hit the gate. I collapsed on the front porch and hugged my boyfriend. Nike got steak for dinner, and I reported the man at the grocery store because I remembered his name on his name tag purposefully. They later contacted me that he had been served his termination papers. My older brother, 4 years old at the time, had just started preschool, and my younger brother had just been born. So I was left without a playmate while my parents were focused on the new baby in the house. Like many kids at that age, I created an imaginary friend to entertain myself. At least this was my parents' rationale. Over the next few months, my imaginary friend and I had become very close. We did nearly everything together. He would push me on the swings, I pulled out my chair for him at every meal, and we would sit in my bedroom and talk for hours. My parents couldn't believe how content I was to spend my days with my imaginary friend. My parents realized my friend was becoming a regular fixture in our lives, and they began to ask me questions about him, and I answered everything I could. "What's your friend's name?" "His name is Uncle Louis." "Where is Uncle Louis from?" "Pennsylvania." "Is Uncle Louis always around?" "Yes, he follows me everywhere I go, except when he goes fishing." My parents were a little shocked when they heard the responses. My father had an uncle named Louis, who lived out on the lake in Pennsylvania, but he had passed away 10 years before I was born. My parents explained that it all felt strange, but they thought perhaps I'd heard a conversation when he was mentioned, and held on to a few of the major details. Not too much time passed before I made a comment to my mum that caused her to freeze with fear. "Uncle Louis says he likes your necklace, Mummy." My mother was always wearing a pearl necklace that Uncle Louis gave to her when she married my father 15 years earlier. There's no way I could have known, and she found this very unsettling, but convinced herself it must have been just a random comment from a 3-year-old. Nearly a year had passed, and I was preparing to enter preschool when my parents noticed that I hadn't mentioned Uncle Louis. I expressed no concern to them about him, but their curiosity got the best of them. One night they asked me what happened to Uncle Louis, and I told them that he drowned. Quite morbid for a 3-year-old, but I, like all other 3-year-olds, did not understand death. My mum was spooked by my comment. My dad was terrified. His Uncle Louis suffered a pulmonary embolism. A blood vessel in his lung was clogged and burst, and he drowned in his own blood. I do not remember these experiences, and only in high school did my parents tell me these stories. My older brother also recalls me playing with Uncle Louis. At the time we shared a bedroom, and he said I would always make sure to close our door at night so Uncle Louis could get some sleep and open it in the morning for breakfast. This happened a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mum in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was taking the 2 youngest of my 3, then ages 1 and 3, to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building off a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep we had owned for 2 years, was one of only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when we got there. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot, as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home. But as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the key. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come, but that it might take a little bit, so I told him my location. I left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows and loaded the children back into their seats once more as we waited. As soon as we watched, all the lights were turned out in the building, and again everyone left, their cars departing one by one from behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in the parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks, and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to take quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled, nodded at me, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit scruffy, but quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes looked that way, especially at the end of the day. And I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab the jump starter cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through the long horizontal slits between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here real quick, he could show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head. saying that sadly there was no reason to show me anything, as I didn't know anything about cars, and just thanked him and continued to stay in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition that was most surely going to come at any moment. At one point, I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting as he spoke, but I was trying above all else to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot, tired, and miserable, and truthfully, I was distracted with the two young kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little more frustrated with me, because I wouldn't come up to look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad when he left us there all alone, with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, the nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very quickly without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me alone with two little ones defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed the southern gentlemanly thing to do. I looked around and was very aware once again there were no visible cars on the road, nor homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, unmarked pickup pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again, this time more apprehensive. Upon exiting, though, he immediately introduced himself, and his name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, pointing and asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I dunno. I thought all this time he was you." And we both laughed slightly. And then he grabbed the jumper cables, walked in front of my car, raised the hood, and started to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, the air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening for the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children, when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice he said, "Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked into his hand, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like looking device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish dust. Yet, on one end, it had tiny circular small finger holes. It was as if it was a mix of a long thin sword and scissors oddly combined. I remember being amazed but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said, just matter-of-factly, that I'd never seen them before, but how weird it was that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years, and shook my head in surprise. He continued to stand there and stare at them, unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, like he couldn't find the right words to speak for a bit and just continued to stare at the unusual object. Honestly, I didn't care about it one bit. All I could think about was getting the car going, letting me pay him the cost, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly set them up on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled me to start the Jeep. And when it immediately caught, my 3-year-old cheered. Gratefully, I turned on the air conditioning in full blast, rolled up the windows, armed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay out. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him so that I could hear the amount I owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up the weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," and held them out for closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands, the item still appeared to be incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality, except for the strangely small 2 loops on the end. I'd never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me, as if trying desperately to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, because they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head and said no, and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but see how sharp they are? These look like they've just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny, dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip were where the rust had been removed and were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted them. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I released the back window so he could place it inside. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way and me turning the other, towards the small winding highway that would lead me home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home, and I got the children safely inside. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like things to them later. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears from my description and measurements over the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I remember wondering how he could even know that, why he would even say that. I had tried so carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping they may be able to lift prints or test for blood if they wanted, but the story seemed to bore him a bit, and he didn't seem interested. His attitude insinuated as there was no longer an emergency, it was of no importance now. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things up, he did say it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days, just in case someone from his office got back with me later. But that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper, placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house, and they remained there for several more years untouched, until we moved away, and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time, though, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did, if my children would still have a mother, if I still would have had my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know. But I learned something very important about myself that day. I've always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people, and staying safe. But because I was exhausted, and tired, and hot, and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit, and wasn't working at that time. And many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could have easily cost us our lives. To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7, so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big sellers around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights in a gas station/liquor store when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online, so they wouldn't ruin my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working overnights for a long time. Even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into a liquor store/gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced one night, because I started working there, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and shove a gun to her back demanding her money. She complied with him and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store, sobbing hysterically, and though police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally prefer having two people on, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The nights seemed to go by so much quicker when there was someone else there, and it was really nice that the person I normally closed with, and I got along with so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and really was only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would only work 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh and I 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't really particularly like the job or want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with one person for more than a week. No one seemed to really like him or enjoyed working with him. Nick was a little off from the start. He was one of those people who told you his entire life story as soon as you met him, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one really wants to know or feels comfortable hearing. One thing he always seemed to talk about was the strain on his marriage. Apparently, he had had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed. But he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to some people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months, when Nick's stories seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't become violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I wouldn't be killing people by any means. I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories, So, as creepy as that was, I assured him that a lot of people needed to take medication for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick to it and are honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed pleased with this answer, and soon after the subject was turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and felt like things were going well with him. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wish he would stop talking to me about it and would leave me alone. Josh had a wife and a daughter who was 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls through the eyes of what his daughter might potentially have to deal with when she was our age, and seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was grateful for, and didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't before long Nick started conversations with me, going into details about why he was diagnosed, instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into here because a lot of it is very violent. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he misunderstood and change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided to Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it and told her friend, which was the manager who asked her to come work there. The manager couldn't really do much, since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things, and told me to come to her again if he made me feel uncomfortable. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working there. After he was talked to by the manager, and soon after 2 other women who worked with him on the night shift reported comments he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were similar to things that had been said to me. Nick was given a final warning and a write-up. The next few times I saw him, he would go on rants about how people there were only reporting him because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither Josh and I had any intention of telling him. He got so angry at one point that he practically was in tears, saying how lucky those twats were, that he was on his meds, and what he would do to them if he was not. Fortunately, it was about that point that his shift ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had come extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking the drink coolers. It is true that they're easier to do at night, but when there were a lot less customers, so it was annoying since we couldn't chat. But we went with it, and I can't remember the time that Josh went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there a while. At that point, I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell chimed signaling someone had come in. I threw out a good evening and I'll be right there, since anyone that comes in that late usually only wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas in cash. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning next to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of booze that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go, or if I should run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young, fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned towards me, and that's when I noticed immediately that there was something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me, nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring. "He leave you here alone?" It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopeful, steady voice that Josh was in the cooler and asked if he wanted me to get him. Again, staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was creeping me out. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he grinned at me in a disgusting, almost singing voice. "You're lying. You're alone." He laughed and took a step towards me, but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point, I should have run to Josh. I should have called for him. Anything. But I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I had never felt an actual danger around him before. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow, stumbling steps, telling me to come here and that he just wanted to talk. I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I could hurt him if I had to. He thought that was particularly amusing and laughed loudly enough that Josh told me later that was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks and see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything, just stared at each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick stared blankly for a moment, then scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there, and he somehow had caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing, with my back against the wall, Coralining Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both our parts, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because Josh was drunk or really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down as he smashed his knee into Nick's stomach, and used the opportunity of his spluttering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the cops as we heard this sickening crack behind him. We both jumped up and looked at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie or an actual car wreck, when something hits a windshield but not hard enough to break through and it just turns all white around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do. I ran to the register, grabbed my phone, going to the corner furthest away from the front door, and huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time he noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so hard. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background, with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address, because just as I got up to look at the receipt to see what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that officers were already on their way, and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at the part of the window he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole he could only reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole that he had formed and said something that I'm sobbing right now even thinking about it, in that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I spoke to him that night. He said in such a happy tone, "They're never going to find you two." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was crapping bricks as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling at us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he realized it wouldn't open. We later found out that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it against us before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he actually planned this. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me some time to slam the back room door shut and lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut. When Nick reached it, he must have heard me crying, because he kept calling out my name, telling me it wasn't me he wanted. He would make sure that I passed before I even felt the pain if I opened the door. He then started stabbing the door, screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to get to it, so we had no idea how long until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last long against his body slams and offered no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to pass here, that my dog would never know why I never came home, that I would never get my degree, that I have enough money to actually start life, that all of the plans for my future, my girlfriend and I, would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There were no police, car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when a gunshot went off at once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence. Then a voice rang out asking if anyone was here. We weren't sure if we should say something. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things aside in front of the door, opening it just enough to put his head out. And then it seemed like the breath just left him. He opened the door and went out into the store, relief all over him. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police, over the scanner, were sending a bunch of cars, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there, because though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said he would run after him, but with the state the store was in, he was scared that someone in there could be hurt or dying. The next 20 minutes were a blur. Josh and I were sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police got there. The EMT had called dispatch and told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were diverted to look for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got home and came in to see my dog's body wiggling excitedly, proudly displaying his flamingo toy for me as a welcome gift. Nick was found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he had been using to do his drinking and drugs in so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently the reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason that Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened, and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening texts and phone calls she had been receiving. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target, and he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of ending Josh's life with me there than Dixie there, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called the owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. In hindsight, it was disturbing what he was saying, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things at that point, that it didn't even register to us that he could seriously be thinking about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months, and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent towards anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired, so it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. He took a plea deal so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and he would go instead to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm sharing this story now, other than the other stories on this subreddit inspiring me, is that I got a call 2 weeks ago notifying me that as long as there is no setbacks to his health status, Nick is set to be released on June 8th of this year, Maud's birthday. When I called Josh, he said that he had received the same news that day. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I have switched to going to college completely online, and am now in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I don't think he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I've heard so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I'll be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had pretty intense nightmares ever since that day. But ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I ever have heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you two. Nick, if it was true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I don't feel safe, especially at night. I don't believe in God, but I pray to anyone that's listening that we never meet again. I was and still am living in Kelowna, British Columbia. At the time I was 17 and living with my mum but working full time. I normally left the house about 4 a.m. to walk into work for 4:30. I started my walk like I did every other morning, got myself bundled up, it was during the winter, put my headphones in and started to make my way to work. I get a few houses down from my mum's place and a guy steps out onto the sidewalk. He shouts something out at me that I don't quite understand because I had my music in my ears. So I pulled out an earbud and asked him to repeat himself. He looked at me with this wide-eyed look, and I immediately regretted asking him to repeat what he said. "Jesus loves you," he says in this creepy sing-song voice. Thanks, I guess. And Jesus wants me to take your life. At this point, my blood ran cold. The street was empty beside us. I was training in martial arts at the time, so I kinda shifted my stance, knowing full well I could get my ass kicked, but I still didn't want to show fear. I reached into my pocket and grabbed the pepper spray my mum handed me earlier for when I walked around at such an early hour. I showed it to him and screamed with all that I could to leave me alone. "Leave me alone right now, I'm gonna call the cops." "Jesus loves you." He said that, half sung, half in a mocking tone, and skipped like an excited child away from me. I walked down the road a bit further and called my parents on the house phone from my cell so that the ring would wake someone up. And when my dad answered, I practically shouted at him to meet me outside with my mum and bring the phone out in case he decided to follow me home. Upon getting there, I called the cops, and they told me something similar had happened to a girl my age, and she kept walking. But when she turned the corner, 3 other guys attacked her and nearly ended her life. Because it was so dark, I couldn't really make out the details about this guy. All that I could tell is that he was high or something. I stayed home for 3 days and refused to leave my house because it happened not more than 3 houses down from where I lived. The police couldn't really do anything as I didn't have a description, and they weren't sure if the attackers and taunting Jesus loves you guy were working together, or if it was just unlucky for the previous girl. I'm a 22-year-old guy from South Africa, and this incident happened about 2 years ago. You must understand that South Africa has been notorious for having a high crime rate, especially at night. I'm a 6-foot-tall guy, relatively big, and I'm a complete introvert. I was never a big fan of going to clubs and parties. My friends always knocked me for being so antisocial and for being such an introvert. So this one time I decided to tag along with them. When we got to the club, it was better than I expected it to be. The vibe and music was amazing, but I never danced or socialized with anyone. My friends went off to socialize and chat up people, being the social butterflies they were. As for me, I just stood there awkwardly and alone until this one girl came up to me. She was petite, attractive, and hit me up with a, "Hey, I'm Chelsea." In my head, I was filled with confusion. I mean, it's not like I was the most attractive bloke. I went with the flow and introduced myself nonetheless. We were then sat at the counter over a few drinks. We had an awesome conversation going. and after a few drinks I noticed the conversation started to feel a bit awkward. She kept on glancing a few times at something or someone behind me, and started to speak less and seemed less interested in what I was saying now. With me being in such a tipsy state, I didn't even bother to turn around and to see who it was she was looking at, and after a few more drinks I had an incredible buzz going for me, and then decided to go out for a cigarette, and excused myself from the girl I was chatting to. As I was outside, I could feel my legs being hard to move. My head became heavy, and I became lightheaded and dizzy. I thought it was just the alcohol. I brushed the uneasy feeling off and went outside, lit my cigarette, and started to browse through my phone. Then I could hear footsteps approaching me. Another guy was coming towards me. He introduced himself as Craig and tried to bum me a cigarette. Reluctantly, I reached for my pocket and gave him one. My vision then started to get really blurry. I was losing my balance and couldn't stand straight. Then I saw two more silhouettes walking towards me and felt a blow to the back of my head. I woke up to the faces of my friends a few hours later, only to realize I was in a hospital bed, and according to them, one of them had seen me going outside when I went for a smoke. They proceeded to go out and join me. When they eventually got there, they saw 3 men holding me as if I were passed out drunk and walking to a nearby truck in the parking lot. My friend then called out the guys. They turned around, dropped me and fled in their truck. According to the medical, I had some drug substance in my body and was in shock. Then it hit me. That girl, Chelsea, she kept on dropping a few of her belongings towards my side of the chair. Me being in a buzzed and happy state, I was happy to pick them up, thinking it was gentleman's etiquette. I was really oblivious to the fact that she was purposefully doing that to distract me. She then probably threw something in my drink, and then began to signal the guys behind me that her objective had been completed. From what I've heard, there were incidences where an attractive girl is used to lure lonely and vulnerable-looking guys into a trap, so the guys can take them somewhere to do who knows what. Their intentions weren't to rob me because they never took any of my belongings. They clearly had something much more sinister planned. I'm glad my friends saw me leaving at the time, and it scares me to know what could have happened if they didn't. Stay safe, people, and be very careful at clubs and parties. Don't lose sight of your drink, and be cautious of strangers who come across as too friendly. You never know what their real intentions might be. My daughter is 3 years old, and we are already seeing that she has intuition. She has set the time correctly down to the minute, and has known when people have gifts for her, who's at the door without anyone seeing or saying anything, and this really freaked me out. I grew up in a haunted house, and had an imaginary friend that I now assume is the ghost that haunted my childhood home. My grandparents still live there, and my daughter and myself went over to visit yesterday. Everything was going normal until she looked up the stairs. She was staring at a corner and started waving and smiling. I asked her what she was seeing, and she said the name Sarah. I have never mentioned this around her or her mother, so there's no way she would have known about Sarah. I asked what Sarah looked like, and she explained perfectly what I remember. 8-year-old girl, blonde hair, green eyes, black dress. I've been freaking out for over 24 hours about this, and I don't know if we can go back there and I can try and smudge the house. I was around 3 or 4 when I met Sarah. I was a lonely kid. I didn't have any friends, just me and my dog. The house I grew up in was behind my grandparents, and the only time I ever saw Sarah was in their house. She was a mischievous little kid and would play pranks on people, move their stuff and open cabinets, etc. When my cousins would come over, she would get really angry. I remember we would be playing and Sarah would be standing in the same corner just staring at me. She was a lot meaner to my cousins, and she would scare them when I went to sleep. I would always have to apologize to get her to play with me again. After I moved, when I would come visit, I never saw her again, but I would hear her footsteps upstairs and see things moving. The other ghost was one that everyone knew about. It was a 6 or 7 foot shadow with red eyes. Myself, my brother, and my cousins have all seen it. It moves hunched over like a humpback. When you see it, you know it's stalking. We would wake up and it would be standing over us, and we would have scratches all around our body. It would run and hide in one of the rooms that we never went in. The room had 8 porcelain dolls, and they would be rearranged. This ghost, for sure, is still in the house, because I moved back in when I was 20, and it would still mess with me. How did my daughter know the name of my imaginary friend? Unless, of course, she's a bit more than imaginary, and could see her too. I lived really close to my school when I was a kid, and there was this big thing for us to play in. So naturally I always went to play there in the evening before supper, or just any time I was bored. It was surrounded by a lot of houses and a busy street, so it was a safe enough place. One day, I went with a friend of mine who was about a year older than me. We had 2 schoolyards, one for the older kids and one for the younger ones. The big plastic thing was in the younger kids' yard. There was a small corridor that let us go between yards, and as we were playing I see this guy wearing a hoodie with the hood up slowly start to walk into the yard we were in. We stayed there for about 20 minutes with the guy, but I felt something was off. I was too young to really know what to do, and imagined he would leave at some point. The problem was that he was slowly walking around a wall blocking all the houses from seeing him, and was much closer to the exit than we were. I will always remember watching him nonchalantly kick a pizza box round as he made his way closer. As I turned to my friend to tell her that we had to leave, because I felt like there was something really bad that was going to happen, I heard my father bellow my name, and saw him running the length of the schoolyard towards the door with my neighbor in tow. My father was in his 60s and took his car everywhere, and that was the first time I saw him really run. The guy bolted, and my father trailed after him. My neighbor brought us to my friend's house, as they all knew each other, and we stayed there until pretty late. I remember her mother trying to explain to us exactly who that person was, and I was terrified. My father, my neighbor, and my friend's father both tried to find the guy. I can imagine how scared they must have been. He's quite tall and intimidating along with the neighbors. The scariest part is that I still have no idea how my father knew, as the guy wasn't visible, and I lived a few houses down from where we were. I'm sure that he saved mine and my friend's life that day. I grew up for the most part in an Australian city, but lived with my grandmother in a small country town in rural Australia for a while. This town was about a 25-minute drive away from a larger country town that we did all our major shopping in once a week or so. We go into this town to do some clothes shopping and pull up into the shopping centre car park, which directly connected to the entrance of the centre, with the closest car park only a few meters away from the entryway. 10 meters from that entrance, there was another entryway to a standalone store. The store was quite large with many aisles, and the cash registers right near the entrance on the left side of the door. We'd finished our shopping in the main center and had gone into the other store to do some shopping, and my grandmother noticed a man who would come in not long after us and was floating around the entrance looking in very suspiciously. We were in an aisle about 10 meters from where he was, and me being the young oblivious kid I was didn't notice him and just continued to look at different shirts for sale. I moved further up the aisle, and every step that I took closer to the end, he inched a little closer towards us. I didn't notice this, but I remember my grandmother walking up to me and putting her arm around my shoulder and telling me to stay right next to her. I remember looking at an item and asking my grandmother how much it was, as I couldn't see a price tag. So I asked if I could go ask the cashier. She reluctantly agreed, but told me to walk straight to the counter and back. As I walked to the counter, he moved even closer to me. It was just left of the door, perhaps 5 meters from the guy, and I'm guessing he thought I was walking towards the exit. As I only changed my direction right as I got to the counter, all of a sudden, he grabbed me by my left arm and tried to pull me towards him. But as I just changed direction towards the counter, he wasn't able to get a good enough grip of me, and I pulled away quickly. He looked so startled and shocked that he just ran straight out the door and into a car just outside and pulled away. That was it. No number plate, no police, no nothing. My grandma grabbed me and we left. I can't help but think, what if this wasn't his first time? What if he succeeded after me? Or if I'd heard stories of children going missing before and after that he was responsible for? Did he spot me while we were shopping earlier and wait for the best opportunity to try it? I hate to think what could have happened and what may have happened after that day. But creepy guy, I now have a baseball bat, and I hope to not meet you again. When I was a kid from ages 3 to 5, I had an imaginary friend called Tom, who was older than me by a few years. I was the only one of my siblings to ever have an imaginary friend. Something that was strange about Tom was that he was always dying and then coming back to life in strange ways. One time from eating peanut butter when he was allergic. Another was when he jumped on someone's trampoline. Maybe I was just obsessed with soap opera storylines as a child, but this is what I've always thought. I recently found out that before having my older sister, and then my brother and I, my mum had a miscarriage. I use the term miscarriage lightly because she didn't even know she had been pregnant until having a heavier than normal period, and when she went in for more fertility checks, they let her know she'd miscarried. Coincidence, right? I'm not 100% sure, and I was often adamant that he was not in fact imaginary, but just the fact that I was a kid and kids do weird stuff. I always maintained that he told me everything about him, even down to his name. This comes in because Tom was the name my mother always wanted to call her son if she ever did have one, although my brother's name isn't Tom. And Tom always perished very suddenly and took maybe a few weeks for him to come back, so to speak. The more I think about it, I've always been super intrigued by the idea of ghosts. Way more than any other of my siblings or anyone in the whole extended family, and have often had a feeling that I wasn't alone when I was the only person in the house. Maybe this interest/predisposition came from being friends with a ghost as a child. And could that ghost/imaginary friend have been my miscarried older sibling. My friend and I, both females, met up first time back home from college. It was a surprisingly nice day outside in the middle of winter, so we decided to get lunch and eat outside. We found a park that had no one there, and we were sitting at a picnic table catching up, when I see a scruffy-looking guy in a large work van with no rear windows pull up into the parking lot. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to him at first, but I noticed he was moving around the outside of the van for a bit, and he kept looking our way. He finally walked down the sidewalk towards us and passed by our picnic table and walked around the back side of the restaurant building to look down the hill on the other side of it, very obviously casing out the place. He walked back to his van, and me and my friend were discussing what we were going to do while I watched him open up the back of the van and begin to dig around it. He made a call on his cell phone, and a few minutes later another male pulled up in a different car. He got out and started talking to the first guy, who, not very discreetly, pointed in our direction. They immediately began walking towards us, and my friend and I scooped what was left of lunch and fast walked out of that place while keeping an eye on them. One of the times in my life I could literally feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. It could have been nothing, but even now I feel pretty certain that they had something planned, and I'm glad that we left. I worked at a summer camp with young children. The camp is divided into 2 age groups, and I work with the younger group, ranging approximately from ages 6 to 9. Today there was this 9-year-old girl called Jane, who needed to sit out because she was upset, as this boy was picking on her. She was crying, saying that it was too hard being human. Weird for a kid, but kids say weird stuff all the time. When I, with the help of a few other staff members, managed to calm her down a bit and get her to stop crying, she sat quietly but still seemed antsy, like there was something else she needed to get out. After a bit of pressing, my co-worker got her to start talking about her friend Lola. She said that Lola is a ghost and that she met at a different summer camp when she was 3. One of my co-workers asked how she met Lola, and she said that these boys were picking on her, and she heard a voice whisper the words, "Defend yourself," before an invisible force pushed them. Since then, she explained to us that sometimes she hears Lola, just a voice, and sometimes she sees her, either as just a passing shadowy figure or a full person. She said that Lola later gave her advice about bullies, saying to use her words first, but if they hurt her, to hurt them. She then offered to prove Lola's existence. Naturally, I was curious, so she told me that she could get Lola to raise my arms. I agreed to it, and she had me stand up and close my eyes. She then did this weird thing and had me say a chant, causing me to feel my hands, holding my wrists and guide them upwards. She then told me to open my eyes whenever I wanted it to stop. I kept them closed for a bit, but then she told Lola to stop, and I felt hands letting go of me. She later told me that sometimes Lola goes too far. She said that sometimes when she asks her to stop doing things, she's stubborn and reluctant to agree. She told me that Lola follows her around to protect her and took a while to reveal her name. Jane said that she asked Lola why she was following her, and Lola said it was to protect her. She says she asked why, and Lola replied that it was because she's such a nice girl. I took her into the office to have a breather for a different reason, and she asked me if she could draw. I said yes, and she drew 3 pictures. The first 2 were normal, a cat and a jack-o'-lantern. The third was of a little girl with what looked like cat ears and a tail. I assumed that one was normal too, until she told me it was Lola. She told me that Lola was 12 years old and part wolf. This made me assume that Lola was probably just an imaginary friend, and that the thing she did earlier was some psychological trick she learned either online or from some kid on the playground. When we were walking back, she told me about how Lola once held her snake up in mid-air. She couldn't see Lola, just her pet snake levitating. And when she called out to Lola telling her to put him down, she took a moment but eventually did as she was told. While I'm not a skeptic, kids often do have very wild imaginations, so I kind of feel like Lola's an imaginary friend conjured to help her through being bullied. But I don't know, could there be more to it? Could aspects of Lola be rooted in more than just a child's imagination? Are there any parts of the description of Lola that could be linked to any myths or legends? Let me know what you think. When I was 17, I got a job working for a major thrift store chain in North Seattle, a location considered by many to be sketchy. The MO of this chain was to buy up old grocery stores or other serviceable old buildings and open up stores. The building was, I believe, one of the old grocery stores of the area. It was tiny and very old. I had made a few friends while working there, most of whom I'm still friends with today, and recently this was brought back up. It blows my mind I could have forgotten this because it's the only actual tangible evidence I've ever seen with my own two eyes of real paranormal activity. Here's what went down. One night after everyone went home, the security alarm went off. That flagged the security company to send a police car and to inform the building owners. So on and so forth down the chain of command until it landed at my friend, the store's supervisor's, feet. Since he lived within walking distance of the store, he was responsible for meeting with the patrol and verifying that the building was all clear. And it was. With that taken care of, everyone went about their business. The next day, he obviously checked the security footage to see what might have set off the alarm. He actually called me and a few others into the office to show us the footage. Let me describe the layout for you, so you can get a better mental image of this first. The front of the store was an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows with 3 doors. An entrance, an exit, and an emergency exit with a big red handle that would trip the alarm if used. The registers stood between that front wall and the racks of clothing, with each rack having a little end cap sign on a little metal post. If you've thrift shopped, I'm sure you know what they look like, as it's pretty much the same in every shop. The back part of the store, the employee-only area, had a bunch of racks of clothing waiting to be priced that sat there for the next morning. So he showed us this CCTV footage. It's dark, it's empty, and nothing seems to be happening for a minute. Then, one of the end cap signs starts to slowly spin. This I could easily write off as a vent draft or something, but things started picking up. The CCTV would pan back and forth between the camera, overlooking the front windows / registers / partial view of the racks, and end cap signs to the back of the housing area where we processed all donations. In the back, you could see the sleeve of a coat being lifted, as though it were being pinched at the cuff and lifted above the collar before being dropped again, over and over. That could not be explained by a draft. Back to the front camera. The sign is now spinning extremely fast, and the crappy cardboard signs that hang with fishing line from the ceiling are swaying like crazy, almost like an earthquake. And then the glass window actually started flexing violently. The red handle on the emergency exit door, a long metal bar, almost as long as the actual door at the front, thrusted up and down, while the whole door and surrounding windows looked like they were being wailed on by someone. or several somebodies. This is what set the alarm off. There was no one there. The parking lot was visible through the glass, and there was not a single person in that entire place. All the activity started very slowly and ramped up into a somewhat violent frenzy, and then just stopped. All within maybe a 1 to 2 minute span. So I have no proof, but it's very frustrating, as the footage has been lost. But I can't think of any logical explanation for any of it. I'm flawed, and I will never be able to forget what I've seen. And that was the better part of a decade ago now. I had recently gotten a job and had more money than I was used to having. So of course, being the fiscally irresponsible 18-year-old I was constantly online looking at Amazon and Groupons and just anything to spend my money on. I found a Groupon for a local pizza/game place just outside of the county of OKC, kind of like a Dave and Buster's, but with a pizza and dessert buffet, among other party place food items. The food was right past the hostess counter on the left, and to the right was a room with chairs and booths and anything to eat at. Typical arcade eatery things. Walking past the food and dining area was the huge back area with the games and a small roller coaster. I went with my older sister, who didn't seem incredibly into the place, but was content to hang out with me and just spend time together. Looking back, if I had a license, I may not have gone with her, and I shudder to think what would have happened. After playing the games we could and found interesting, she wanted to sit down and eat. We had gone on this simulated roller coaster ride with the double plastic seats and a screen in front of them, the kind that shakes and tilts and gives kids a good time without giving their parents a heart attack, on a real roller coaster. She joined me for one of the simulated experiences and said that she felt sick from it. It's understandable since it's very jerky and our mum has vertigo, most likely passing it down to us. But I wanted to do the rest, because it was the most fun we had since we went in. She said I could by myself, but she was going to grab a plate and wait for me. I don't know what made me get back up, but as soon as she left, I really didn't want to be alone. I'd gotten lost before as a young child in a similar place, so I figured I was just being socially anxious and paranoid as normal. Even though nothing was wrong, I still didn't like being alone in public, because I'm just over 5 feet, barely over 100 pounds, and look much younger. I got up, found her at the buffet, about to sit down, and hurried to grab a plate and a slice of pizza, and a few sweet things. Shortly after we sit down and start eating, a young woman sits next to me, and luckily for her, I'm on the passive end, and while I'm incredibly uncomfortable, I shift over to give her room, mostly just to distance myself from her, because I always try to keep my boundaries, and don't like people touching me. If she had tried that stuff on my sister, she would have not budged an inch and probably even bumped her off. If it wasn't weird enough that this weird lady sat down next to me, she started acting like she knew us, saying stuff like, "I can't believe you guys left me back there. I was calling you. Wow, Erin, why are you ditching us?" All the while laughing like we tried to pull a joke on her, and she saw through it. My sister looks at me. "Do you know her?" Even though she's 100% sure that I don't, she just wants to establish we aren't friends and maybe she mistook us for them in some way. I shake my head. "Okay, who the hell are you, woman?" "I'm sorry, but we don't know you. Please sit elsewhere," my sister said. Her words polite but in a matter-of-fact tone. I should also mention, my sister practically raised me because we had a single mum, who, if she wasn't working to support us, was going out on dates to try and find Mr. Right. So my sister is amazingly protective of me and an absolute rock star when it comes to weirdos trying to make me feel uncomfortable. And she knows of my social anxiety and boundary issues, so this whole situation is not okay. Don't be silly, we went to high school together, this woman says, still trying to insist we simply forgot her. This raises huge red flags for my sister, because we moved around a lot from a young age and almost never stayed in the same place for over a year. Not to mention my sister attended high school in Hawaii, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and I attended the same school in Hawaii and a school in Missouri, and 2 others in Oklahoma. We both attended the same high school a few years apart in a very small town, so small that even people in neighboring areas hadn't heard of it. The school that I uniquely went to was in a smallish town, and I dropped out when I was 18, because they were racist and sexist amongst other things. I stayed quiet, my sister getting annoyed. What was the name of the school? My sister asks, knowing she'll never say the name of the school we attended. Oh, you know, we went together. We even had a few classes. Don't you remember me? She said her name was Bunny, and neither of us knew anyone personally with that name. No, I don't remember you. Which school was it so I can try and remember? My sister pressed, and the woman kept saying that we should remember her and tried to avoid the question. My sister then got fed up. You need to leave. We don't know you. You're making us uncomfortable. And after a bit more of trying to convince us we were wrong, she got up, huffed off through the door that looked to be employees only. And I didn't get close enough to see if it was the case, but the bathrooms were on the other side, and no one went near that door, save a few staff. It was a strange occurrence. We finished eating and considered telling the security guards, but since she was already gone and nothing actually happened, we shrugged it off and went home, not feeling like sticking around in case she was lingering. Writing this gave me horrible feelings looking back. If I'd been more independent and got my license and went alone, or if I'd have stayed at that ride and she pushed herself next to me and tries to force conversation, I would have been too awkward to say anything, and might have let her go too far. What could her intentions have been? My sister feared she might be a scout for traffickers or something, because she kept repeating the same lines and looking around. Perhaps she genuinely thought that we had gone to school together, but in that case, why could she not say the name? I think it's just too odd of a situation to completely discount the fact that it could have had a very nefarious intention behind it. Back in 2007, I found myself working as a bartender at a now closed pub in my hometown. Not a job I particularly liked, but it paid the bills. At this time, they had hired a new kitchen manager that we all simply knew as Kearney. Kearney was a pleasant enough guy, mostly keeping to himself, but always stayed late to help the barman do our closing duties, so we all liked him for that. New in town, Kearney had yet to find a place of permanent residence, and I had recently lost my tenants, so someone suggested he asked me. He was considerably older than the tenants I usually took in, but having a streak of bad luck with tenants my own age, I thought an older man with a nice steady job may be a shift in the right direction, so I agreed. Kearney wasted no time and followed me home that very same night, only he wasn't alone. Enter Lawrence, the boyfriend of Kearney. Honestly, I hadn't even recognized he was gay up to that point, but was water off my back regardless. Looking back now, what really should have bothered me though was Lawrence's appearance. He looked like he had been sleeping on the streets, rather appropriately as I would find out later. Kearney moved in. Lawrence was there a lot too, and it was easy to know when due to his mobile ringtone sounding like the quacking of a duck. Kearney had some habits that were rather noteworthy to this story. In particular, he basically never closed his bedroom door no matter what he was doing in there. It was always open. And although he was a heavy smoker, he never once smoked inside the house. After Kearney had been living there for about 2 weeks, I had come down with an awful case of pink eye. This being highly contagious, I was given leave of absence from my bartending job, and therefore decided to go wait it out at my sister's for a few days. Apparently I didn't mind giving it to her. The day my sister was scheduled to come pick me up, I took a casual stroll into the bar that myself and Ben, a good friend from high school, at the time, co-worker, had been building in my house. And something caught my eye. All our liquor bottles were completely empty. Now, those who had been frequenting my house at the time would know that we weren't just talking about 1 or 2 bottles of brandy here, but bottles of whiskey, gin, vodka, snaps, liqueurs. Basically, it was a fully stocked bar that could host pretty big parties without requiring much in the way of additions. So I called Kearney in, asking him what he knew about this, receiving feedback that Lawrence and he had been on a slight drinking binge. Those were the actual words he used, and had left me both furious about the thousands worth of stock they had drunk out, but also slightly impressed that he was actually still alive. Regardless, I said that I would be dealing with this upon my return. So I'm with my sister for a few days, and on Friday I get a call from my local police department, asking me if I know Conrad Schultz. Ironically, even though I didn't, they finally add that I will probably know him as Kearney, and that I should probably come down to the station, as they had just arrested his boyfriend, trying to sell my camera equipment. So my sister rushes me back home where all my camera equipment was on display at the police station. It's on this visit that I am informed that Lawrence was actually a Navy SEAL, who got dishonorably discharged before turning to a life of crime, and now had a rap sheet the length of the Bible. The kicker was that both he and Kearney were actually homeless men who had met at the Salvation Army. So Lawrence is in jail, and my sister drops me off at home more or less at the same time that Kearney gets home as well. Based on Kearney's accounts of what happened, he had turned Lawrence in himself, as he couldn't allow Lawrence to do what he was trying to do. Although I had appreciated his sacrifice, I still told Kearney that he would have to go, having been the overall cause of this. However, not wanting to leave the homeless man, homeless, I gave him until the end of the month to make another arrangement. Monday comes, and after having completing staff meetings, I walk home to encounter a very much free Lawrence sitting on the sidewalk across my house watching it. I confront Lawrence as to why he's there, and he tries to apologize before begging for money. Rather out of character, really. I dismissed him without giving him a cent. Now, I go back to the previous night. See, I had mentioned the staff meeting for a reason, as it was at this meeting where we had gotten a rather sizable list of liquor bottles that had gone missing from the storeroom, leaving us all suspecting each other. I, however, would not have to wait long to figure out who the real culprit was, as a few days later, I opened the garbage bin in my kitchen to see the missing bottles all empty and staring back at me. I decided to sit on this information for the time being, although I did photograph it all just in case, as I needed it for evidence later. I'd also called over Ben to inform him of the developments, as this was quickly becoming a detective game. We decided to enter Kearney's room to search for further evidence. Nothing of vast significance in there, with one exception, 2 single photographs of Lawrence. Before he had turned into the homeless version of Lex Luthor, actually there were several of Lawrence's things still there. But as Lawrence had spent a lot of time there before the incident, I accepted this as normal. Now I should also add that I had mentioned Lawrence's release to Kearney, and had told him that if I even suspected that they were still seeing each other, I would throw him out of the house myself. Only a few days would pass before this came into play. On this particular night, I had been bartending again, and Kearney had constantly been stopping by the bar to help himself to draft glasses half full of wine and half full of Coke, which he would go drink outside the restaurant. We confronted him about this, But, as he correctly pointed out, he was still a manager, and we had no right to tell him what he could or couldn't do. On his fourth trip, however, I had grown suspicious and decided to follow him outside, where I encountered Lawrence sitting out sharing the half-Coke, half-wine concoction. This annoyed me, so the next day I returned to the restaurant with photographic evidence that I handed over to the general manager, who was also a friend of mine. Although I hadn't physically seen it, I had heard the confrontation through the office door when he fired Kearney. Kearney left obviously upset, and apparently had no idea that I had been the one who turned him in. So we had closed early that night and I was walking home. Going past the high school, I saw Kearney coming from the opposite direction. He walked past me, literally only saying 2 words, "I'm scared," before disappearing into the darkness. That would be the last time that I would ever physically lay my eyes on Comrade Schultz. So we reached the final week before Kearney's eviction was to take place. Ben had come to stay with me for that duration, as we both wanted to monitor the situation and make sure nothing else happened. It was in this week that Kearney's behavior suddenly changed. He was constantly smoking in his room, and his door was closed 24/7. In fact, neither Ben nor I had caught so much as a peek of him in that entire week, which we hadn't thought much of at the time. The day of Kearney's eviction comes around. Ben had got home for a few hours, and I finally hear Kearney's bedroom door open. Someone walks out the room, opens the front door and leaves. I follow him outside, but somehow he's already completely vanished. What was left, though, were his house keys, indicating he obviously wasn't planning on returning. I look at the keys and notice something strange. Although the correct keys were on the keychain, there were also several that weren't mine. Why would he leave me all the wrong keys? His room was a shock, not because of the state it was in. The two had broken his bed in an act of wild monkeyness, but I had already known about that. As I said, he never closed his doors. But more than that, he had literally left almost all his belongings behind, with one exception, the 2 photos of Lawrence. Upon further investigation, I suddenly realized that all traces of Lawrence ever being there had completely vanished, with all of Kearney's stuff left behind. There was one thing of Lawrence's left behind though, his duckling ringtone, which it turned out hadn't so much been a ringtone as an actual duckling, which now strolled around casually in the vacant bedroom. We called him Neville. So Ben returned and gets updated about the developments, both of us thinking the way he left was rather weird, of course, and the whole thing had been very strange. It was only when I asked the infamous question that this all becomes a conspiracy theory. Did you ever actually see Kearney in this week? It was to our shock that we realized neither of us had, and suddenly started putting puzzle pieces together. The changing habits, Neville the duck, the wrong keys, only Lawrence's stuff being gone. It was to great discomfort that we both asked the question, who had really been living in our house this last week? During the last few days, Ben and I went on a mission, searching the town, crawling into drainpipes, trying to find any trace of Kearney's whereabouts, but they all added up to nothing. Comrade Schultz had simply vanished off the face of the earth. This wasn't the case with Lawrence, though. He was still around, having made some new homeless friends. We encountered him several times, begging on the streets, and every time I asked him, "Where's Kearney?" but he just acted like he'd never heard of him. The last time I would see Lawrence was across from work, attempting to break into a car. I called the police on him, and they arrived rather quickly, arresting him on the spot. While he was being led away by police, I shouted at him one last time, "Where's Kearney, Lawrence?" But he ignored me and let the cops drag him away. The next day I filed a missing persons report, as I thought Kearney was missing, and suggested that Lawrence may know something about it, but never came of it. So Lawrence, I don't know if you did something to Kearney or not, but if you did, let's not meet again. For those of you wondering what happened to Neville the duck, we kept him for quite a while, but due to the malnourishment he received his first few months, he never grew and ultimately passed away. For those of you wondering what happened to the case, unfortunately, South Africa has a very unique way of closing cases, as in after a month or two, they just send you a text saying, "Case closed due to lack of evidence," or "Case closed with no arrests." I didn't get one in this case, but did get one in an armed robbery I fell victim to in 2017, so not too helpful that they did much effort here. Regarding Lawrence, I saw him one more time after getting arrested. He was only locked up for about a week. After that, though, he disappeared. I'm not sure if he left town or got arrested again. This happened when I was roughly 3 to 4 years old. Me and my family had just moved into a new house after the rent on our old house became too high and my mother couldn't afford to pay it anymore. One day, about a week or so after moving in, as me and my mum were home alone, and my older sister was at school, my mum was in the kitchen making me lunch and doing the laundry when she heard me giggling and talking in my bedroom. She thought nothing of it, because it's fairly normal for kids to talk to themselves while playing with toys. When she brought me my lunch, she found me half laying under my bed, talking. She asked who I was talking to, and I emerged from under the bed and replied, "I'm talking to my friend Rose. Can't you see her? She's under the bed." Now, my mum doesn't believe in the paranormal or anything, but this gave her the creeps, and she made me eat my lunch in the living room and told me to watch cartoons so she could keep an eye on me. Fast forward a few days, and my mum has a neighbor over for coffee, and I'm sitting on the floor playing with my toys. Somehow, the topic of Rose came up, and my mum was telling the neighbor about it, and the neighbor starts asking me questions about Rose, like what she looked like, what we spoke about, and so I answered. She's older than me. She's a teenager. She's got ginger hair and green eyes. She tells me about her mummy. Her mummy was bad. My mum will never forget the look on the neighbor's face. The neighbor then asked to talk with my mum privately, and it wasn't until recently that I found out what the neighbor had told her. It turned out that Rose wasn't just an imaginary friend. She was the ghost of a girl who had previously lived in the house. From what I've been told, Rose was a 16-year-old girl who lived in the house with her mum about 10 years before we moved in. Her mum was an abusive alcoholic, and from what I've heard, that's why Rosemary chose to end her life at the play park across the street. She was sick of her abusive mother and overdosed on painkillers right across from the house. It still saddens me to think of her, because as someone who's been close to doing the same thing, as someone who's dealt with various forms of abuse, I feel her pain, and I just wish she had the support I had when I was in that dark place. I'm a 23-year-old male from the UK, and like everyone, I have a story to tell, and this one is 100% true. But first, allow me to put things into some context. At the time of the events in this story, I was 13. In fact, I had only turned 13 weeks prior to the following event. This happened to be my hometown, a small coastal town on the southwest coast of England, a place where I no longer live. I moved not because of the memory of these events, but because of work and my love life. On the night these events began, my group of neighborhood friends and I gathered, like we always did, to play a game called Manhunt. It's a bit like hide and seek, but when the manhunter catches you, you join his or her team. There are two other types of ways to play this game. There's flashlight manhunt, where the manhunters use flashlights to catch you, and if they keep you in the flashlight beam long enough to count to 5, you're on their team. And then there's torture manhunt. This one, you would catch hold of one of the hiders and beat them a little until they gave in. Thankfully, none of us ever went that far. The worst I've ever got was a kick to the balls, and the worst the girls in our group ever got was a light bear hug. The torture for them was being hugged by us guys, as we had for the most part all grown up together, so they give in because of the awkwardness more than anything. We played 2 games of Manhunt on our housing estate, which is basically the UK's government version of government-provided housing for families on low income, all lumped together on land that is useless for anything else. We played these games from around 6:30 in the evening to 7:45. We all sat in the estate park after these games. It was pitch black at the time in the evening, and this was the middle of November, it getting dark early. We were all of varying ages. The oldest of the group, who lived next door to me, was 15 years old, Joey. Joey had heard on the news that there was supposed to be a meteor shower that would be clearly visible in the sky later on that night, between the hours of 10:30 and 2 in the morning. He suggested that we go and watch it. We all danced around the idea for a while, and then one of the girls, Amy, decided to jump up and suggest to ask our parents if we could all go as a group. None of us were sure if our parents would let us go, and figured it wasn't worth asking. But she pointed out that Joey and the oldest girl of the group, Lexi, who was 14, both had cell phones, and both of them had all our parents' numbers from when we all hung out together, and our parents needed to get a hold of us. This was back in 2008. Not all kids had cell phones back then like they do now, and even if they did, they were lucky to have anything that resembled a cell phone of today. After Amy said that, we all jumped up and began to run home to our parents, begging to be allowed to stay out and watch the meteor shower. It was a Friday night, so there was no school the next day. Joey and Lexi stayed in the park and called their parents from there. I walked with my then boyfriend Callum. I'm bisexual and have known for some time at this point. He was 13 and had only been 13 for a short period of time, as he had his birthday 2 weeks after mine. We'd started dating each other 3 months after he and his family had moved, 6 months before these events. He'd asked me out. He was thin, had a mop of shaggy black hair with pale skin, and was shorter than me, with brown eyes your heart could get lost in. I was only 13 and never had a boyfriend. I had one girlfriend, but that didn't last, nor did we get serious, so of course I said yes. He too was bisexual, but he didn't want to tell people about us, as he felt it would be weird for both of us to like girls and each other, and he felt like no one would understand. Believe it or not, things weren't as politically correct back then, nor were people as accepting. There was still a lot of homophobia around, in our town at least, and especially in our high school. We walked slowly down the hill to our street from the park, just talking about what we had done in our English class at school that day. When we rounded the corner to begin walking down the street, Callum stopped and grabbed my hand. I was confused. It was the first piece of affection he had shown for me all night, and it was in a public place, which wasn't like him at all. I looked up at him and saw him staring off up the street ahead of us, just beyond the turning to the street we lived on. In a patch of grass was a street lamp. He was looking at the street light. "Can you see him?" he asked, his voice trembling a little. "What?" I said, and looked at the street light. And he was right. Just beyond the glow of the light cast by the street light, a man was standing in the shadows. He just stood there, not facing us at first, but he must have become aware that we were staring at him, as in the light we saw him turn to face us. I could feel his eyes on me, looking right at me, I felt like they were looking into my very soul, and Callum's grip on my hand grew tighter. I then noticed the orange/red circle where his mouth would have been. He stepped forward into the light, blowing a cloud of smoke from his mouth. He didn't say anything, but carried on staring. "Do you think he knows Jake?" Callum asked me. Jake was a guy who lived in the house that the guy was stood next to. Jake was in college, and it was common knowledge that he was a pot dealer, a man with no morals. He even tried to sell it to me and Callum once. He seemed to be one of the only two people on our estate who guessed we were a couple, as he called us lovebirds when he tried to get us to buy pot from him. Jake was a strange guy, but was harmless enough. He was pretty much a hippie. I don't know. I said to Callum, "Maybe?" Although this guy under the streetlight didn't look like the type of person Jake would hang out with. This guy wore a dark, full-bodied tracksuit and a baseball cap. The guy stuffed out his cigarette against the metal post of the streetlight, chucked it to the floor, and walked towards Jake's house, disappearing behind the hedge that led to his backyard. I heard a sigh of relief from Callum. "I'm so glad you were with me then," he said, squeezing my hand. "Let's go," I said. "Yeah," he replied. Although we weren't telling anyone about our relationship and not being affectionate in public, we walked down our street holding each other's hands, only stopping when he let go to walk into his house and I to mine. We didn't think to tell anyone about the creepy guy with the cigarette. All of our parents said that we could go watch the meteor shower, so long as no one drank any alcohol. But of course, when you tell kids that age not to do something, it's a sure bet they are going to do what they were told not to. We all met up at the park after getting confirmation from our parents and decided to go to the top of the hill called Duckett's Hill, as it was a well-known landmark. Not for any special reason, it just had a very good view of the marshland that surrounds it. We walked to Duckett's Hill and settled on the top. Joey and a friend of ours called Tyler started a bonfire as it was cold, and it was a chance to have a real kids-only get-together. Amy and her older sister Faye had taken 4 bottles of some cheap, nasty wine from their parents' wine cooler and decided that we all needed to drink some. I decided not to, because I felt like someone needed to keep an eye on the fire with a sober eye, and I had this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that the creepy cigarette guy could turn up and start watching us. As we waited for the time to go by, we all sat around the fire Joey had built up, passing the wine bottles from one person to the next, all of us taking a sip each time except for me. I passed it on to Callum, who sat unusually close to me in front of our friends. He was so close, he could rest his head against my shoulder, and if the wind was in the right direction, I could smell him, a mix of Lynx Africa deodorant and the cherry-scented clothes detergent his mothers used to wash their clothes. It's a smell I'll never forget. Somehow we got onto the subject of who in the group would make a good couple. This left me and Callum a little uncomfortable, as you can imagine. We'd been secretly dating for 3.5 months, and we'd only made it to third base. And our relationship was, as all relationships are at that age, pretty fragile. Amy, who was 12 and the youngest of the group, Tyler, Faye, Callum and me were all 13, pointed at me and said, "So who would you date out of the girls here?" I look around at everyone sheepishly. "I dunno," I said, shrugging. Everyone groaning in disappointment, even Callum did. I later found out he was genuinely interested in who I would be dating in our group if not him. Before I could show my nervousness, I blurted out, "I mean, you're all pretty hot. It would be hard to choose." This was a lie. They were all pretty hot, but I'd thought about asking Faye out a month before Callum moved in across the street from me. She was almost 14 and was a very hot emo chick. All of us in that group were skateboarding emo types, although me and Callum were the only guys who didn't have the typical emo hairstyle. Mine was just dead straight and shoulder-length hair. His, as I mentioned, was long but shaggy. He still had a way to go before it got to my length. I had had a crush on her, but when I tried to ask her, I got too nervous and bottled out, mainly because I couldn't get her alone to ask her. Amy was hanging out with us at the time, and I had to hype myself into asking her again, but by the time that happened, Callum had moved in, and my world changed forever. Everyone groaned at my answer, even Callum, who made a joke about me wanting to date all of the girls in the group and being a man-whore. I can't remember what he said exactly, but I know he put an arm around my shoulder and pulled me close so he could screw up my hair. "You know," Lexi said, "you and Callum would make a cute couple." And then added, "We could use a gay couple to bring some sassiness to the group." Callum sheepishly laughed and said, "Yeah, good one," before gently pushing me back to how I was sitting before he grabbed me. I stoked the fire and stood up. I needed to pee. So I walked away from the fire to the crest of the hilltop. I didn't go far in total darkness. I stood close enough to the fire, and they could still see me, but far enough away to have privacy. I started staring at the hill as I relieved myself, when I noticed something I had seen earlier. A circular orange-red glow from the lighted tip of a cigarette. My urine flow stopped mid-pee. The man from the street lamp was back. He was at a distance away, but close enough that all I could see of him was the tip of his lit cigarette. His eyes were on me again. I could feel them bearing into me. A light emerged where the guy's hands would have been. It was like a small flashlight. He whirled the letters C, U in the air, and then it switched off. The cigarette fell to the floor, and I could just about hear the sound of him making his way through the tall, knee-height meadow grass as he walked away down the other side of the hill. Once he was gone, I carried on my business. From behind me, I heard Joey call out to stop touching myself, which of course made everyone laugh, even me, although it was nervous laughter. I returned to the circle around the fire, not knowing whether I should warn the others or not. I looked at Callum side on. I just took him in for a moment. His button nose, his eyes, his noticeable but not too prominent cheekbones. He had a pretty face for a boy, although it was clear he would grow up to be a handsome and chiseled young man. He seemed to be relaxed and happy, so I decided not to ruin it and keep what I saw to myself, a decision I would later come to regret. We carried on talking for a while. After 2 of the 4 bottles of wine had been drunk, someone, I can't remember who, suggested that we roll down the hill in the dark. Everyone has rolled down a hill as a kid, and for some reason in everyone's tipsy state, doing it in the dark was an amusing prospect. Joey decided to stay at the fire to keep an eye on it, letting the rest of us roll down the hill. Callum had never consumed alcohol to this level before, and was a lightweight. It had gone to his head a bit too quickly. He wasn't massively drunk, but he couldn't quite walk without staggering a little, and he didn't want to roll alone. So he grabbed a hold of me, pushed me down to the ground, straddled me, and we rolled down the hill. It was a weird moment for me. I knew the creepy cigarette guy was out there, but in the arms of the boy I loved, so there was a sense of joy there too. When we got to the bottom of the hill and stopped rolling, he didn't get up right away. He kissed me. I kissed him back, but before we could make out or anything, we heard heavy footsteps behind us, moving amongst the grass. We both shot up and ran up the hill, neither of us saying anything to each other. The 3rd bottle of wine came out and passed between us all again. This time I took my one and only sip for the night. Callum took a few gulps. I leaned in and told him not to drink any more, because he wouldn't be able to hold his drink. He nodded and stopped. As it turned out, my warning about him drinking came too late. He was swaying and staggering hard as he walked when we left later. I kept my eyes peeled for Cigarette Guy, but cannot recall seeing him again while we were there. The clouds in the sky hadn't cleared, and the meteors should have been flying over us. It was 11:30. and we decided it was too cold and we were all too tired, and that it was best that we went home. We put the fire out, switched the flashlights on, and walked along the path that we had used to get to the hilltop, back to the road. For some reason, as we stepped onto the sidewalk, Callum decides that he wants to go to our estate's local store, which was open until midnight on Friday and Saturday nights. He wanted to grab something to eat. I tried to get the others to come with us, but they wouldn't. I have no idea why. It was known in the group that me and Callum were close, but I always assumed that the others didn't know how close. I could have been wrong. But even today, I still think that Lex had a suspicion about mine and Callum's relationship. I thought it back then too. She just seemed to drop hints here and there that she knew what we were keeping to ourselves. This was reinforced to me that night as her parting words for us were, "Boys have fun, just play safe," which made us laugh, of course. To get to the local store from where we were, we left the group and we had to walk down a hill that was normally full of traffic during the day, but at this time of night it was as quiet as a back-end country road. We walked slowly on the sidewalk, my arm around Callum's waist. I was holding him up, and we were alone now, and he would have staggered into the road otherwise. When we reached the bottom of the hill, he had to stop. He said his head was spinning. He leant forward into the road, his hands clasped around his knees, and began to retch and throw up. "I told you wouldn't be able to handle your liquor," I said. He half turned and flipped the bird at me. I laughed. I looked up at the top of the hill to see if anyone was there, and there wasn't. Callum threw up once more and stood up, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. I was looking up at the top of the hill when he grabbed my arm and started pulling me along the sidewalk. "What's up?" I asked him. "Look behind you," he said. It was the creepy cigarette guy from earlier. He was stood under two large oak trees that stood at the entrance to the small side street that had about 8 houses on it across the road, where Callum had thrown up. The field where the fire was, right next to this little street. "Hey boys," the man said, in an accent that gave away where he was from. I grabbed a hold of Callum, picking him up practically, and started running. As I said earlier, he was shorter than me and a lot lighter in weight. I had to put him down as we reached the store though. He got heavy after a short time, but we kept on running. We didn't have to run before we reached our housing estate. We had to pass the estate next to ours, and then we would be at the end of the road leading into the one that our streets belonged to. We kept darting, looking over our shoulders behind us, and the cigarette guy was jogging after us at a leisurely pace, as if to keep a safe distance, almost like he was toying with us. Once we reached the road that led onto the estate, Callum started freaking out. He wasn't hysterical, but had tears running down his face. "I'm scared," he told me. I always thought I would be a cool-headed and cocky type of person in these situations, but I wasn't, and I had to admit that I was scared too. I'd never been so scared, nor have I been. "Me too," I replied. We reached the turn into our streets, and like idiots, we stopped to catch our breath. I think Callum wanted to stop crying before we went to his house. I was staying there that night. We had become friends the day he moved in, and it was like my second home. Sometimes I spent more time there than at my house with my mum and 2 sisters. I was over there so much, I even had my own toothbrush, bath towel, and 2 changes of clothes. I hugged Callum to try and keep him calm. There was no one around, and frankly at that point I didn't care if anyone found us hugging. I was just glad to be alive and away from Cigarette Guy. I looked down to the entrance to our estate, and the Cigarette Guy was there again. So we ran across the grass verge that went along the top of our street and down to Callum's house. The house was all in darkness. His mum has not stayed up with us. We knew this was a possibility, but we hadn't expected it. Callum was struggling to get his keys from the pocket of his skinny jeans. That's a bit of a horror movie cliché, I know, but it's the truth. I looked up to the entrance of our street and he was there. Cigarette guy was just standing there. It was so cold, you could see the breath steaming from his mouth. I shook Callum and told him to look. The guy raised a hand and waved a slow camp wave with his finger. Callum looked at the keys and found the right one, opened the front door as quietly as possible, and we crept inside, locked it behind us, and went upstairs. We went to the bathroom to relieve ourselves and brush our teeth. Callum cleaned himself up a little bit. He had a bit of puke on his chin. Then we went into Callum's room. We got undressed into our underwear and into the separate beds. Callum had bunk beds. He was on the top, I bottom. We would do this when I slept over in case his mum or sister came into the bedroom, so they wouldn't catch us in the same bed. After they had been in bed for an hour though, I would climb up the ladder and get into bed with Callum. We spent the next 20 minutes talking about Cigarette Guy and what he could have wanted from us. I couldn't think of a single reason he would have for wanting to talk to two 13-year-old boys in a small coastal town in that area of the UK. Using kids as drug runners is as rare as unicorns, so non-existent. I don't want to be by myself, babe, Callum said. I climbed down the ladder and got into bed with him. We talked for a while longer and tried to take our minds off creepy Cigarette Guy. At around 6:30, Callum woke me up, shaking me violently. I looked at him as if to say, "What the hell?" But he wasn't looking at me. He was pointing at his bedroom window. He looked terrified. I looked to where he was pointing, but the blind was down. And on top of that, the curtains were drawn too, so I was confused. You couldn't see anything on the outside. "Listen," he whispered to me. There was a slow but soft, methodical knocking on the windows. It was soft enough to not wake up the whole house, but loud enough for us to hear. Callum's window was directly above the front door, and below the window was a porch with a roof-like shelter. His mum had put a strong trellis for a creeper plant to grow on each side. The trellis was strong enough to support the weight of a fully grown man, if he were to climb it. Callum wanted to call the police, but I said no. I was getting foolish now. I thought I could deal with this. I stood up and walked over to the window. I went to one side and peeked around the blind. I could see the creepy Cigarette Guy out there on the roof of the shelter. He looked at me through the gap in the blind and waved that girly wave again. He then plastered a piece of paper through the glass of the window, folded up, and placed it under a stone on the outside windowsill. He put a finger across his neck like a knife cutting someone's throat, climbed back down from the shelter, and I pulled up the blinds and watched him walk away up the street into the darkness of the early morning. Once he was gone, I opened the window and grabbed the piece of paper. I unfolded it, and there was a message scrawled in terrible handwriting which read, "Watch your backs, you little craps. I know where you live." I showed the note to Callum. He begged me to tell his mum and call the police, and I told him we needed to relax and think about how to proceed very carefully. It could be a mistake, I told him. He may have mistaken us for someone else who didn't pay him or something like that. Really? Somehow I highly doubt it. Who would mistake us for the Cray twins? Callum said. Honestly, he did have a sassy side that would come out in intense situations. We folded up the letter and hid it under the black rug Callum had on the floor. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands and then came back to bed. We slept through until 10 a.m. and decided not to tell anyone. We wanted to see if the guy would show up again, and we agreed that if he didn't, then we'd have nothing to say. We never saw him again. We asked Jake, the pot dealer who his friend in the baseball cap and tracksuit was, and Jake said he didn't know anyone dressed like that, or anyone from Liverpool. After that, we said nothing more to no one. Callum and I stayed together for another year and a half before we decided to mutually end things. We both had met other people we liked. I have now married the girl I dated after me and Callum split, and we have a child together, and I'm working as an English teacher at high school level. Callum went on to date another guy for 3 years. As far as I know, he is now settled down with a woman he met while backpacking around Spain. I'll always remember what happened that night. I haven't thought about it consciously for years, except for yesterday, as I was standing at the gates of high school, the one I teach at. Me, along with 3 other staff members, have to supervise the kids as they leave school to get onto school buses and into their parents' cars, etc. As I stood at the gates doing this, I saw a man in a dark full-body tracksuit wearing a baseball cap smoking a cigarette, and the memory of the whole night came flooding back in detail. I wrote it down to share this experience with others anonymously. Keep your eyes peeled, folks, because anyone can be dangerous. Cigarette smoking man, let's never meet again. I live in Melbourne, and at the time I was living in a small flat near a popular street called Chapel Street that has a pretty busy nightlife. My flat was located about 100 meters off a main road, just behind a police station, a 5-minute walk away from the street, and due to this I always felt relatively safe walking home alone from chapel after a big night out. So in order to tell this story, I have to go back a few months before the incident. I regularly shopped at the Woolworths just up the road from me, and was approached by a Jamaican man one day after walking home from getting groceries. He began talking to me. He told me that he had seen me a few times at the supermarket and had always wanted to say hello. I was flattered, and we struck up this innocent conversation about what it was like growing up in small towns and moving to a big city like Melbourne. He insisted on walking me home. This was a foolish mistake. I felt a bit uncomfortable about this, but didn't want to come off as rude, so I figured I would just wait till he was out of sight to go inside so that he wouldn't know which flat I lived in, as there were 8 in total. He seemed like a nice guy, and when we reached my building I said goodbye and he asked for my number. I didn't really want to give it to him, as I was already seeing someone, but I figured maybe he was just looking to make friends in the area. He messaged me the next day asking me to take me out on a date, and I politely declined and told him I had a boyfriend. That was the last I saw of him. At least, I thought. Fast forward 7 months, and I'm walking home at 1:30 a.m. from a bar on Chapel Street. As I'm walking home, I see a guy in the distance walking towards me. I thought to myself, he looks familiar. As he got closer, I realized it was the Jamaican guy again. Just a weird coincidence, I thought. When he reached me, I said hello and expressed my surprise at bumping into him. This is when things begin to get really uncomfortable. He began telling me how he was at a bar with his friend when he saw me walk past. His friend, after discovering he knew me, told him to stop being such a baby and go talk to me. So this guy had jumped into his car, driven around the corner down the road and parked up ahead in order to catch me. This made me feel uneasy. "Come have a drink with me," he said. "I've already been out, I'm heading home, it's late. I really want to just go to sleep. Sorry." "No, come on, come have a drink." He grabbed my hand. I gently pulled away and said, "I'm really not interested in drinking anymore. I want to go home." "Please come for a drink." This little dance went on for a good 5 minutes with him continually grabbing my hand and pulling me away. I thought he would get the hint. Then he changed his tactics. "Let me walk you home." "No, thank you." He argued this with me for a while, then started repeating, "But I know where you live." I don't know how he thought this would magically make me trust him. It only succeeded in freaking me out, and at one point I remember him saying, "Screw the police." I can't remember the exact context of this statement though. We argued for a good 15 to 20 minutes before I gave in, a little worried what would happen to me if I flat out told him to piss off, and he ended up walking with me. As we were nearing my building, I had decided I really should say something to get him to leave before he saw which flat I was in. Just as I was about to talk, he said he should go back to his friend. I was completely relieved but still shaken. He asked for my number again, and I didn't want to say no because I knew he wouldn't take it. And I didn't know if he would get aggressive. If I gave him a fake one, he could test it out before I left. I have had that happen in the past. So I complied, and as soon as he was out of sight, I ran to my flat, locked the door, and proceeded to check all the windows were secured. I lived with a boy who worked in the casino and was hoping that he would be home that night. I was very upset to find out he was not, and I called my housemate terrified and told him what had happened and asked when he would be home. He told me he wouldn't be back for another 4 hours due to night shift and to call the police if he came back knocking on the door. The guy messaged me about an hour after, saying how good it was to see me again, and then text me in the morning too. After calming down and gathering my strength, I replied to him, saying that the way he had approached me had made me quite uncomfortable, and that I would appreciate being left alone. Haven't heard from him since. He's probably not a dangerous guy. I just hope he learnt not to approach women that way after our encounter. It may not sound like much of an ordeal to you, but if you'd have been there and seen everything from your own eyes, you'd have been pretty terrified as well. When my little sister was between the ages of 2 to 6, this was a long time ago, mind you, but she's 27 now, she had 2 imaginary friends, Madden and Jacob. She was 2 when she started talking about them in serious detail. Every girl in my family starts talking at a very young age, her younger than the rest of us, so believe me, she was detailed. She told us their hair color, their skin color, and what they liked to wear. Madden had pale skin and long blonde hair, while Jacob had brown skin with black hair and a red baseball cap. We had no idea where she got the name Madden from. It seemed kind of random. Nobody in the house played Madden football, and she stayed home with me and my mum until she began school. She talked about them more than she talked about anyone in the family. She talked to them all the time, until one day she just stopped. She started first grade, made some visible friends, and never mentioned Madden or Jacob again. We just chalked it up to childhood imagination. Well over 20 years later, I have a daughter. She began talking at 1, and by 18 months was speaking like a pro. One day I was watching her jump on the bed. She was 2, and I was standing there, and she looked at me and said, "Mama, go downstairs, we won't fall off." So I said, "Who won't fall? The 5 little monkeys?" And she nonchalantly said, "No, me, Jacob, and Madden." I was floored, but I immediately called my mum and sister to see if they had mentioned Madden or Jacob recently. They both replied saying that they had completely forgotten about them, and were all so weirded out. Even my super analytical engineer dad was like, "Whoa." I asked my daughter where she heard the names Madden and Jacob, and she simply said, "They told me." Everyone I've told this to is like, "Oh, I'm sure one of you mentioned it to them when she was really little and you forgot all about it." But I know we didn't. As I said, we had all forgotten about my sister's imaginary friends. It isn't exactly a common topic of conversation, is it? Until my kid said she was jumping with them. She's only mentioned them twice since then, and it's been months since she did last. I think the story is nuts. What do you think? When I was 11, I lived very close to one of my friends called Anne. She had a little brother named Matt. During summer vacation, me, Anne, and Matt would always hang out pretty much every day. Anne lived right across next to this little bridge that went over the train tracks next to her house. Right over the bridge, there was a road that went down to this facility and then connected to the main road. I'm not entirely sure what this building's purpose was exactly, but it was some sort of financial advisement building. Since we were curious kids, we would sometimes go snoop around there, and we found this shed right behind it. This was an epic find for us as it became our clubhouse. There was pretty much nothing in there but rusty nails, and it was always unlocked for some reason, but we thought it was cool, and we would meet there almost every day and just hang out, even if there was nothing special to see there. Now one day, I had come to Anne's house, and we were heading down to our clubhouse as usual. Then out of the blue, this random man comes out of nowhere and starts walking towards us. It's obvious we were going inside the shed. Matt's hand is on the doorknob. I'm the eldest of us, Sam being a year younger than me, and Matt 3 years younger than I. So I was sort of the leader. "What are you doing?" he asks. He seemed mad for some reason. Of course, we had no explanation. We were kids that didn't understand private property and had just found this cool shed to hang out in. "Nothing," is the only thing I could utter. He starts lecturing us about it not being okay and kept talking about the important things in there and that we weren't allowed to go in. He made it seem as though he worked there, even though he'd just come from the opposite direction of the facility. I now realize he was rambling, but it seemed very justified to us because we were scared as hell. It was just weird because I knew that the building was closed. It was Sunday afternoon and all the lights were off. But he spoke with such authority we just listened. Straight up fear. He then started demanding we come with him and starts walking further down the street, saying he's going to call the cops if we don't come with him right now. We're scared out of our minds and just follow this grown-up, thinking we've committed some sort of serious crime. He leads us to his house, and we kind of stop outside, because we've been lectured about going with a stranger, and all that since we learned to talk, so it felt wrong, and we were hesitating outside, Anne holding her brother's shoulder warily. Our savior then comes. She's walking her dog. She doesn't even say anything. I don't even think she saw him. But he just closed the door when he saw someone coming. I remember his face so well when he saw this random woman. We were so scared we just ran home immediately after he shut that door and never crossed the bridge again. This happened a few years ago, when my daughter was around 4 or 5. I'll also mention that although I've never seen a ghost, I can always sense a presence, and whether it's good or bad. My daughter started talking about her friend Emily. I just put it down to her imagination, that she's creative, and always has been. Emily was mentioned a lot. Then one day I was home alone just having coffee and watching TV, when I heard my daughter's toys going off, and they were all the sort that had to be pressed and pushed to make noise. She's monkey obsessed, and had a big pink monkey that made monkey noises when the middle is pressed, but it's difficult to press it right, if that makes sense. This monkey was one of those toys that went off, so I got up and walked to her room, and a couple of her other noisy toys were going off and flashing. The light on her small fish tank was on, even though I knew I'd turned it off. I lived in the UK at the time, and was on top-up electricity and gas, and was a bit freaked out, but not overly due to our old house having some serious hauntings going on. That was more of a malicious feeling, and I didn't really feel that uneasy with this. I then noticed it was time to go pick up my daughter from school, so I switched off the light and left. On the way home, I thought I'd talk to her about Emily, and she started telling me lots of details, like Emily is 18, she has long brown hair, her full name is Emily Rose Ward, and she died when she got sick, and she wears a long nightie. Ward is a fairly common surname, but my great-grandma's surname was Ward, and she passed away shortly after my daughter was born. I knew she had 2 sisters, One of them was called Emily, who passed away of tuberculosis when she was 18. I'm now convinced she was my daughter's imaginary friend during this time. I've never told this story to anyone, as my family are very much, if you can't see it, feel it, or hear it, it doesn't exist, and my husband just mocks me about my belief in the paranormal. But I thought this might be worth sharing with all of you. I grew up around the world. My parents were divorced, and they had joint custody, so I lived every other year with the other parent. But their jobs required them to move every 1 to 3 years to a whole new country, so I'd usually only stay in one place for a year or two. I moved to India in 1995 as a freshman. This was the largest school I'd ever been to. I was fat, pimply, and scared of the new school. I'd always been good at making friends, but this school was harder. Most of them lived here their whole life, so it's hard to break into those circle of friends. But a large portion was similar to me, kids that moved often, although not as frequent, so they weren't as receptive to new kids either. Every fall we did something at the school called a mini course, where everyone in high school had to sign up for a 5-day field trip. There were tons. It was a big school, and seniors got priority of course. Some trips were like sailing the Ganges, or hiking some mountain, or riding trains to Agra. I can't remember, except the 2 I went on. In freshman year, I went rafting the Ganges. It's exactly what it sounds like. 6 kids in a raft, with an experienced rafter, and we went down different portions of the Ganges and camped in tents. There were 2 sophomores, RJ and Steve, and they were snooty rich kids, pompous and arrogant. They seemed to take a real liking to picking on me. I'd been picked on before, but this was rough. One morning they tied my clothes together and threw it in the water, tied it to a branch and stuff like that. The chaperone was kind of a jerk too. He asked me who did it, and I said, well, if I can't prove it, what does it matter? And he said, that's what I want to hear. I mean, he had heard and witnessed the harassment and never intervened. I was never one to tattle. That's just not something I was raised to do. Anyway, it sucked. The rest of the year I didn't have any problems, but every time I saw these 2, they always did or said something that just upset me. We're just general bullies. Slapping my lunch out my hand, unzipping my bag so my books would fall out, that kind of stuff. Over the summer, I hit a growth spurt, went on diet, and shot up 5 inches in 6 months. And with good food and exercise, I was looking pretty good. I even made the basketball team as a sophomore. The coach was the chaperone from the previous mini-course, funnily enough, and I had some more friends. RJ and Steve were always into weed, but now I think they were into some other stuff. They looked different next year, acted differently, meaner, generally irritable. They still tried to pick on me, but when I used to walk away, I could feel like they thought they had won, and now I could tell that walking away annoyed them and made them angrier. The mini-course came around, and Coach wanted me on cycling some mountain ranges or something like that, and he thought it would be good for my conditioning. So I went, and sure enough, RJ and Steve were on the trip as well. I had the room next to them at the hotel, and it reeked of weed the entire time. Then we'd go and ride some portions of the hills, then back again, and they'd be smoking. At dinner and stuff, they would make jokes about me, and I kept ignoring them until one of the seniors berated them for being bullies. They loved it. They laugh, and really I think they just loved the attention. Going up to my room, I saw them in the hallway, and they threatened me that if I told the chaperone that they were smoking weed, they'd stab me. And I said, haven't told him yet. Why would I do it now? Next morning, I was going to hang back and pick up stragglers since I was riding pretty well. Usually, it was some freshman or less athletic kid in the back. This time it was RJ and Steve. I slowed down for them and told them we only had 10 minutes to get to the stop. Steve, in response, threw a stick at my wheel, then they both sped off laughing. It didn't do anything, but they were laughing as they went around the corner and out of sight. Then I heard, "Oh, and stop. As I came around, I saw them both falling off the mountain and into the trees. I slowed down, looked over the edge, and I could see a branch poking through RJ's arm. He was looking up at me, then down, then up, very confused, and I couldn't see Steve. For a reason not known to me today, I didn't do anything. I kept riding. I don't know why. I was raised to always do the right thing and help people, but at that moment I felt like they deserved it. I know they didn't, but I thought they did for some reason. It was a real battle in my head. I got to the top of the mountain and the chaperone asked if everyone was okay. I said I think so, but I didn't see Steve or RJ. I'm still unsure why I lied. It was a strange sensation. It was so natural to me, I didn't even feel like I was saying it. The chaperone rode back down the mountain to find them. The other chaperone guided us back to the route we were doing. When we got back to the hotel, they were loading RJ and Steve into a van. This was about 2 hours later. It wasn't an ambulance. I guess the van was faster. They were bloodied and black in some spots. Steve, whose whole head was wrapped, and when he leaned forward, blood would pour onto his nose like a faucet. Then the Indian guy would push his head back, and I looked right at RJ and didn't say a word. He was on morphine or something, was completely out of it. There was so much blood on his pants and shirt. They both came back after Christmas break. RJ before Steve. RJ's arm was still in a cast and his foot was in a boot. Steve had a scar between his eyes where he fractured his skull. It was pretty bad. Something you don't forget. His skull didn't look like it set right, like it had shifted, but it wasn't as noticeable as his scar. I heard them talking to girls sometimes, saying how the morphine felt so good, and that they should switch over to that. In general, they didn't seem to act all that different. Anyway, a number of years later, now in my adult life, one of these pair actually wound up getting a job at a company that our company had just acquired. When I was talking to my VP, they told me that one of the pair had actually wanted to talk to me, as when they went down they were expecting to see me. Anyway, I obviously didn't have any intention of going over and seeing what he wanted, and I, for the most part, tried to put it to the back of my mind. Then in 2015, I had to go over to the acquired business for some work, and the thought hit me, and I thought that maybe I'd just pop in to see what it was that he wanted to ask me 3 years ago. But when I spoke to the project manager, they told me that he had a plan not to get fired, and that he'd made a real mess over at the company. I mean, his firing was inevitable, and once he did, he went off the rails, got back into drugs, and ended his own life. I tracked him down on LinkedIn and Facebook, and it was true, he had passed. I do wonder, though, what his plan to not get fired was. Was it perhaps trying to apologize to me? Who knows? For the first 2 years after graduating nursing school, I have worked in this nursing home. The things I have experienced at my night shifts have made me believe in the paranormal. I will share my experiences with you. Some are about patients that have recently passed, and a story about a poltergeist haunting me at work. Background. The nursing home itself is only 20 years old and quite modern. There is a large tree yard with all kinds of fruit trees, and there is some water surrounding the property. The nursing home houses about 100 patients. All of these patients have dementia in the later stages of the disease. Because of this, many of the patients pass within the nursing home. Our job as caretakers is to make their lives as enjoyable as possible and bring comfort in the last stages of their lives. An older male patient of my ward developed pneumonia and passed within a week. This man was not able to speak much more. The only things he would say is, "Who can help me?" in a very distinct voice. 5 days later, I had my first of 4 night shifts. A message appeared on my pager that a sensor detected movement in another room at the end of the hallway. When I went to take care of the patient that probably needed a pee, I walked by the room of the deceased male. When I crossed his door, I heard him call in his distinct voice, "Who can help me?" Not being able to think very fast, I planned to take looks at what's going on after I helped the patient from my pager. A few minutes later, I stood within the now empty door from which the deceased called out. Only then I remembered he was to be cremated the next day. Chills went down my spine as I realized. After this experience, I studied a bit more about the paranormal. Many of my more experienced night shift colleagues told me they were experiencing similar events. I also got told about a probable poltergeist who resided in another ward, in a more abandoned room in the other ward. A few months went by and the occasional feeling of being followed occurred. I've also had an experience where the temperature around me would drop drastically and I would suddenly feel freezing. I later found out this could mean there was a ghost present. We had 2 house cats that were always fighting each other in the hallways. Besides that, they are sweet and cuddly pets who spend a lot of time being loved and petted by the patients. These cats would sit at the door of patients that were passing. They didn't make any noise, they just sat there waiting. Sometimes they even tried to sneak into the room of that patient just to sit on their beds. After a few months, I transferred to the ward with the probable poltergeist. The feeling of being watched continued frequently in this ward, and we had many more paranormal occurrences. When a patient passed, sometimes bed sensors would go off randomly in the rooms of these patients. This was frequent to happen after the patient passed, and lasted until they were either buried or cremated, which usually happens a week later here in the Netherlands. My understanding and interest about the paranormal grew, and the more I knew, the more obvious things would happen. Within a month, I experienced another situation like the first experience I described. A patient with a distinctive cry. She always cried, due to illness. She shared a room with another female patient. When I went to check on the woman after the other one had passed, I was about to close the door to the room when the distinctive crying of the deceased woman filled the room. This went on for 5 seconds and then just stopped, and the room was quiet again. Now, the poltergeist I mentioned. The room that he inhabits is number 3, which has something to do with the evil spirits according to Ghost Adventures. The room was used in the times where the nursing home was full of patients to house the terminally ill, as lots of patients passed there. The room kind of fell out of commission when the demand for nursing home beds went down. People that were passing could be nursed in their own homes since there was no longer a waiting list for new patients. The poltergeist would follow me around the ward if I passed the room. When I got an uneasy feeling of being followed, I knew that it was there. Sometimes it would make my emotions go from really angry to being sad to the point I had to fight not to cry. Being a young male, this is abnormal for me. At some point, the sensor of that room would go off, even when there was no one in that room, and the sensor wasn't activated. I never had the guts to go into that room alone, and always asked for backup. A lot of my regular night shift colleagues knew what went on in that room, and would always be very helpful. Sometimes sounds like small knocks on the doors could be heard, or the walls, and I once heard something scratching inside the door. There was also a time I saw a figure standing in the window of room 3. The figure had a human appearance but was plain black. It really freaked me out. There was one colleague in particular that I would share my experiences with. She was paranormally gifted and could see ghosts, and has the ghost of a small boy in her home. She told me the poltergeist couldn't do anything to me if I didn't let it. The tip she gave me was to speak to the entity and tell it not to bother me, or to leave me alone, and for the most part this did help. Around the time this happened a lot to the irregular night shift colleagues, and they quit because of this. But using the tip I got from my colleague, the night shift became more relaxed to me, and not being stressed out about this cheeky spirit. My theory is that when people pass, their spirits remain within the nursing home, mostly residing in their room or ward. Sometimes they might try to contact people by saying something or making a noise. I don't really know. No one truly does. But after they tend to be buried or cremated, I feel like their spirits move on. This event happened 20 years ago, when I was 9 years old. My family took a ski trip to West Virginia, a ski resort. My dad really wanted to get his money worth, so he had my whole family come out on the slopes about 20 minutes before the lifts were even running. It was something like 15 degrees and around lunchtime. My mum and I were getting too cold to have fun, so we decided to get hot chocolate at the food hall while my dad and brother and I stayed out for a few more advanced runs, and all agreed to meet for lunch about an hour later. My mum and I got our hot chocolate and were warming up in the food hall when I got a second wind. The kiddie slope was right outside the building, so I asked my mum if I could do a few runs while waiting for my dad and brother to return. My mum was usually extremely cautious about letting my brother and I do things on our own, but from where she was sitting she had a view of the slopes through the window, and probably for that reason said okay. At first everything was fine. I was thrilled to be out on my own, and I felt invincible, blasting down an easy slope after the trickier ones I'd been on with my parents. I went down a few times and was feeling good, when I started to notice myself passing a specific man over and over. This man was very distinctive looking in the crowd of skiing families, wearing 90s style snow gear. Tall, wearing what appeared to be a black trench coat, not a ski jacket, with a long dark beard and dark-rimmed glasses, and a black hat with a rim. As a 9-year-old, his appearance kind of scared me a bit like a cartoon villain, and I began to feel like I was seeing him everywhere. It wasn't a huge slope, but it still seemed like we passed each other more often than I was passing other skiers. I also started getting the sense that he was trying to get on the lift with me, like waiting to get in line until after I did. Even though we never ended up being put on a lift together, I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if he really was showing up way too often, so I decided to test him. The next time I got off the lift, I went back down the slopes like normal, knowing he had been on a few chairs behind me, and would probably come right down the slope as well. When I was about halfway down the hill, I stopped suddenly and the man passed me. That's when it started getting weird. After passing me, the man went a little way further down the hill and gently fell down in a controlled way. He sat on the ground and watched me pass him, and then immediately got back up and skied the rest of the way down the hill, getting in line for the lift, several people behind me. I don't know what he said, but he spoke to each of the people that were in line between him and me, and managed to get right behind me as I was about to go on the lift. Right as the chair came around, he got up beside me and tried to get on the lift with me. At the last second, I played dumb and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead," and stepped back to let him on. He seemed surprised by what I said, but got on alone, and I got on the next lift with a mum and her daughter instead. They were really nice, and I had a good chat with them on the way up the hill. For some reason, I was too stupid and shaken up to tell them about the man. I was hoping it would look like they were my family, or at least someone else on the slope that was paying attention to me. At this point, I felt pretty sure that this creepy man had singled me out, and years of my parents saying stranger danger and that training told me that it was probably time to find my mum. I resolved to ski back down to the food hall as soon as I got to the top. Instead, I got off the lift, said goodbye to the mum and daughter, and was immediately approached by the man who clearly waited for me at the top. He came right over to me and said, "Are you all alone, little girl?" It's funny to think back now, but at the time I remember being kind of insulted at this question because it sounded so much like all the cheesy lines my parents would come up with when they taught my brother and I about stranger danger. I couldn't believe this guy could think of a less obvious question to ask, or that he actually referred to me as little girl instead of pretending to know me, or something less conspicuous. I think his audacity in that regard kept me from being as afraid as I otherwise may have been. It made it seem like a game or simulation, which probably helped me act more natural. I answered him in a very matter-of-fact way, saying that I wasn't all alone, and pointed to a nearby man and his teenage son, saying that that was my dad and brother. Then I walked away very casually, as if I wasn't at all weirded out by his question, and skied down the hill to the food hall where I quickly found my mum. I told her all about the guy and the weirdness, and while I was telling her, I saw him come inside and start walking around with his head high, clearly scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone. My mum was really freaked out and didn't let me leave again, even to get food. My dad and brother arrived soon after that, and my mum told my dad the story. He brushed it off as someone probably being awkward but trying to look out for me, but my mum wasn't too convinced and neither was I. I think about that guy every now and then, and wonder what was really going on with him, why he was dressed so unusually and unseasonably while skiing. Why was he only skiing on the kiddie slopes when he didn't seem to be with a family? Why did he notice me at all? All that I do know is that I never want to see him again. I had an imaginary friend. Her name was Emily. She had long blonde hair and her face was half gone. She told me her mum passed away when she was very young, and her father got very sad and took his life, and she never told me how she passed, just that her dad did it. One day we were playing outside in my mum's garden, and my mum yells that it's time for dinner. So I go in as usual, but ask if my friend Emily can join as she was a friend, and never told me she wasn't real. So she said yes and that we can share a plate. After eating, we go outside for a walk, and my mum always liked to get to know the people around. Now there weren't many kids in the neighborhood at the time, so I was usually by myself. Well, while my mum was talking, the older woman saw me and said, "It's great to see more kids round here. We haven't seen much since the accident." Well, my mum got to wondering and asked what happened. So the older woman said that there was a little girl who used to live here called Emily. She lived with both her parents until her mother died, and Emily was the sweetest child you could ever meet. She said that she was around my age when she passed. Well, flash forward. She's talking about the mother passing and how the father became an alcoholic and started to get heavily into drugs. I guess no one found out until they passed. That's when I told my mum about Emily, the one I've been hanging out with, and said something along the lines of, "That's the exact same thing my friend told me." And my mum gave me a look and asked what I meant by that. So I told her that Emily told me that her dad had ended her life and then proceeded to end his own. The lady gave us a weird look. That happened to be the day I found out how she passed. Her father beat her with a hammer, and that's why her face looked like that. And after that day, it was the last time I ever thought or saw her until now. I had a dream last night of her, and she was with my little brother. I woke up so fast and ran upstairs, only to find my brother talking to someone on the couch, but no one was even there. Then today is when he started to talk about her to me. I told him everything, and now I don't know what's gonna happen. This happened a few months ago. I was at my friend Will's birthday party. We met at a nice big park and spent the evening swimming and making mojitos. I spent most of the evening talking to a mutual acquaintance of Will and me, Oliver. Early on, we noticed that me and Oliver lived in the same part of town and decided we'd go home together later, since it was quite a long way. I'm a small female, so the prospect of not having to ride the subway alone in the middle of the night was calming, to say the least. As the evening progressed, Oliver became more and more flirty with me. I brushed it off and didn't engage on that, since I have a boyfriend and Oliver knew that. Eventually the party started breaking up, and I was still chatting with Oliver as the other party guests were packing up their stuff. That's when I felt his hand on my butt. I told him calmly to stop touching me, and he obliged. As I tried to explain to him that touching me was not okay, he suddenly became aggressive, called me desperate, amongst other things. At first, I got him to calm down and even apologized to him. And then Will approached us and told us his phone was missing. I left Oliver behind to look for it with another party guest, Tony. We separated from the group to search another corner of the park when Oliver appeared behind us and began screaming. He started to push Tony as he accused us of betraying Will and leaving Will behind and that we stole his phone. He turned to me, insulting me in the worst way while only inches from my face. Tony managed to get him away from me, and he eventually ran off. I broke down crying, since I fully expected him to hit me. Tony managed to get me to calm down, and we rejoined the group. When we did, we found Oliver with them, cursing and running berserk. Will's girlfriend, Rachel, was crying, and as I pulled her away, she told me that Oliver struck her in the face. While Oliver ran through the park screaming and swearing at us, we gathered the group and left. As we did, Will, completely drunk at this point, insisting on returning to the park to find his phone. So he, Tony, and me went back in and used Rachel's phone to try and track his. I knew it was idiotic and dangerous, but Will wouldn't listen, and I didn't want to leave my friend alone. I always carry a small blade in my backpack, and this was the first time I took it out with me. I'd never been so scared. We followed Rachel's phone as it led us to the bench, and who did we find? Oliver, slumped over the bench asleep. After checking if he was okay, Will reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Oliver had it the whole time, and had accused us of stealing it and scared us to death when he was the thief. After waking him up and telling him to go home, we left. I ended up crashing at Will's place. I have no idea what went into him that night. Everything points to a bad trip, but to my knowledge, there were no other drugs other than alcohol involved. I'm still nervous to see Oliver since we live in the same neighborhood, but I'd rather not meet him again. A few years ago, I went to a motel with a few friends. There was a restaurant right in front of the hotel. It was literally in the same parking lot. My friend and I, us both being girls, went to the resto bar around 2 a.m. It was open 24/7, and some of our guy friends waited for us a bit further in the parking lot. We couldn't see them from the inside though. We get to the resto bar and I feel a creepy vibe right away. There was only one employee, a girl in her mid-20s, and us 18-year-old girls and a creepy dude sitting at the bar. The guy looked up at us, up and down with a smirk. The girl was just standing there, stiff as hell. At some point she said, "That's it, I'm calling the police." My friend and I looked at each other, confused. The guy got up and got closer to her. He was about to follow her to the back stall, but she put her phone up to her ear and he backed off. My friend and I started walking to the door. I wanted to scream to my guy friends to come and help, but we didn't get the chance because the creepy dude ran after us. Long story short, we found ourselves in between the resto doors and the exit doors. The girl, still on the phone, ran and locked us out of her restaurant. The guy blocked the exit door with his body. He started saying stuff like, "You girls are so hot. Makes me want to do stuff," and things like that. After what felt like hours, the police got there and arrested the guy. We got out of there, and they asked us a few questions, and that was that. We went back to our guy friends who had no clue what happened. I had an imaginary friend. Her name was Emily. She had long blonde hair and her face was half gone. She told me her mum passed away when she was very young, and her father got very sad and took his life, and she never told me how she passed, just that her dad did it. One day we were playing outside in my mum's garden, and my mum yells that it's time for dinner. So I go in as usual, but ask if my friend Emily can join as she was a friend, and never told me she wasn't real. So she said yes and that we can share a plate. After eating, we go outside for a walk, and my mum always liked to get to know the people around. Now there weren't many kids in the neighborhood at the time, so I was usually by myself. Well, while my mum was talking, the older woman saw me and said, "It's great to see more kids round here. We haven't seen much since the accident." Well, my mum got to wondering and asked what happened. So the older woman said that there was a little girl who used to live here called Emily. She lived with both her parents until her mother died, and Emily was the sweetest child you could ever meet. She said that she was around my age when she passed. Well, flash forward. She's talking about the mother passing and how the father became an alcoholic and started to get heavily into drugs. I guess no one found out until they passed. That's when I told my mum about Emily, the one I've been hanging out with, and said something along the lines of, "That's the exact same thing my friend told me." And my mum gave me a look and asked what I meant by that. So I told her that Emily told me that her dad had ended her life and then proceeded to end his own. The lady gave us a weird look. That happened to be the day I found out how she passed. Her father beat her with a hammer, and that's why her face looked like that. And after that day, it was the last time I ever thought or saw her until now. I had a dream last night of her, and she was with my little brother. I woke up so fast and ran upstairs, only to find my brother talking to someone on the couch, but no one was even there. Then today is when he started to talk about her to me. I told him everything, and now I don't know what's gonna happen. I was just in Cuba with my family, and we took a tour of the city. There were people asking for things, which was completely fine, but there was one man who was quite clearly drunk off his arse, swaying and carrying around a beer. He was being very aggressive and standing right up close to us, poking us for things. It escalated to the point he started grabbing at my sister's baby when he was feeding him, so I got in the way and stopped him. There was an extremely kind Cuban lady who stayed with us and told the guy off. Extremely kind, considering our tour guide was nowhere in sight. The man proceeded to yell at her and then began ripping wiring out of a garden and was trying to hotwire two 220-volt wires, which was our cue to get the hell away from him. I'm extremely grateful for that lady and watching over my family and making sure that he stayed away. Even got pictures with her and made sure to give her a large sum of pesos as a thanks. I had an imaginary friend, and his name was Nobody. He was just a shadow of a normal person, but 5 times the size of me, and it wasn't just me looking at my own shadow. He was someone I'd see and think about, always distinctively opposite of my real shadow. And for as long as I was thinking about him in that imaginary friend phase, he represents thoughts that served as nothing but contrarian to anything I was thinking. Even if there were negative or malicious thoughts, the thoughts I'd have in response, that at the time I perceived as coming from him, were things like, "No, that's stupid and childish. That's the wrong way. You'll have to wait till you're older." Weird stuff like that. Sometimes I imagined him staying in places on the opposite side of my shadow, when I got used to it, and then he'd start moving and walking around me in a circle, tapping my own shadow in the head as he walked by and then coming back or moving closer. It was loopy. Most friends I have, if they even had imaginary friends, say that. It's quite creepy. I'm a 31-year-old female, and I've had a long history with drugs. I started using heavy, hard drugs when I was 21. Now, I'm 5 foot and 135 pounds. I've always been on the smaller side, not the type you'd look at or even imagine I'd touched a joint in my life. I have a baby face, and most people guess I'm 25 years old. When I was 21, I looked like a preteen. A good example of this was when I was 18, my boyfriend and I went to Cincinnati Reds opening game, and the first 100 kids under 14 got a free bobblehead. Well, I received a free bobblehead. My poor boyfriend felt very awkward to say the least, but this is getting off topic. Just basically, I want to point out how I look young for my age. This event happened when I was 23, so I looked like I was 16. I was sitting alone on a notorious drug street in a very bad area of Cincinnati. This was incredibly stupid of me, but at the time I had this mentality that I run the streets. I have these hitters that got my back, so no one would ever dare mess with me. Obviously, this was a very stupid mentality to have, which was tested and changed my mentality forever, and made me far more street smart and cautious. In fact, I am very lucky to have made it away from that situation completely unharmed. It definitely messed me up for quite a while, and made me much more aware of my surroundings, and who I deal with and who I trust. I was sitting on the street waiting for my lottery guy to pull up, to give me my lottery tickets, and be on my way so that I can play the lottery. I'm sitting there in my vehicle, minding my own business, jamming out and not paying any attention to anything going on around me, because I had this stupid mentality that I was untouchable. This guy comes and taps my driver's side window. Bear in mind I've never seen this guy before, but anyone who knows anything about playing the lottery on the streets knows that sometimes there are others who come and bring your deliveries. It's not always your same guy, but generally they will let you know if someone is taking their place. So I crack down my window, and they go, "Hey, you looking for some tickets?" "Nah, but if you want to throw me a ticket with your number on it, I'll keep you in mind, because I do play a lot of games. It's always good to have more than 2 guys." "Ah, cool, I live right there. I'll go grab you some tickets and be right back." No red flags going off just yet. Because bear in mind, a lot of lottery dealers get new customers in this way. Then I see him coming back with another dude. My car was this little Honda Civic with manual locks, and I did not lock my doors. That's when this guy immediately opens the driver's side door and puts a weapon against my head. "Are you pregnant?" he asks, and this catches me completely off guard. It was winter and cold, but me being female, I'm like, "No, I'm not pregnant. Do I look pregnant to you?" "Give me your money," he says. Now, never before or since have I been in a situation like this, and honestly I feel very blessed by this. He keeps telling me that I need to give him my money, or that he'll pull the trigger. I have horrible anxiety, and honestly, I couldn't think of what to say, and just said, "Give me a minute. I just need a minute to think." He actually stops and goes, "Okay." The horn on my car didn't work, or I'd have been blowing it like crazy. Now, me being a big lottery player and only having enough money on me for 2 tickets, I couldn't give this dude my money. I'd be sick, and I had work and stuff to do. So I call his bluff. I don't have any money. My lottery dude fronts me my tickets, I say. I watch him as he moves the weapon around to whip me, which he wasn't even doing correctly. At that moment, I knew this guy didn't have it in him and had no idea what he was doing, fortunately for me. So I lean my face into the passenger seat and proceed to bicycle kick him in his nuts. I had Timberland boots on, unfortunately for him. Then I start screaming, saying that I'm being robbed and that his fingerprints are all over my car door and handle. This has the desired effect. Him and his friend start running away, and as you can imagine, I did not go back to that area to purchase my lottery tickets anymore. Thankfully, I no longer buy lottery tickets, but if you do buy off the street, please be safe out there, and always lock your doors. I just want to say something. If you are someone who buys lottery tickets off the street and don't want to be, I do want to say there is hope for you. I was told by my counselor at rehab that there was no hope for me, and they were wrong. There was hope, and I'm doing great things now. I may have lost everyone and everything, but I also began to gain that back after I lost my way. But I'm back. I'm fortunate enough to have a great mum and family who are always there for me. Please, don't think it's too late like I did. We all have someone who loves us and needs us, regardless of what you do or have done. You're special and amazing. And I just think that there are some of you out there who may need to hear it. But you're worth it and special. You can find yourself again, and there is hope for you. Being an only child, I made up an imaginary friend called Joyce. She was another little girl that I spoke to, played with, and even went as far as making a birthday party for her. I never physically saw her or even spoke to me. My parents didn't really think much of it and just let me be. The first weird thing that started happening was every day after school, a little girl would always call asking me from different area codes. This was a landline phone, so when you left a voicemail, it would be played on speaker. Sometimes she would be angry, which my mum thought was weird, as when she would answer, the little girl would hang up. My mum started noticing that these calls were from different states and continued for about 3 months. Second was a string of weird things that happened. The neighbors always used to say they saw a little girl at my window when we were out or I was playing outside. They thought I had a sister, and my mum would hear a lot of noise and footsteps. The scariest thing was when she came home and heard running upstairs and slammed doors. My mum immediately screamed because she thought someone had broken in. The police were called, and no forced entry, and nothing was found. We would take pictures, and these people would appear. A bride with long black hair appeared walking past my dad on the couch. Another time, these ladies came out sitting at the table. I could go on about the weird experiences, but the scariest one was when the little girl, or whatever the hell it was, called again. Since it was late, my dad thought it must have been a work call, and when he picked up, it was a little girl crying, asking for me. My dad got goosebumps, and he's a skeptic. Asked her what she wanted, and she wanted us to pray for her, and then it hung up. After that, we went to church, and the next day a priest came to bless our home. Pretty much everything calmed down after that. Did I bring my childhood imaginary friend to life? I've never really believed in the paranormal, but haven't denied it either. But after tonight, I'm 110% sure that it exists. I work in a care home for the mentally challenged / severely handicapped. We have 2 people working night shift, 1 awake and 1 sleeping in case something happens that needs 2 people. Yesterday, was my first awake night shift. Nothing spectacular happened, just sounds I've never heard while working day, and didn't really pay any mind to it. I just thought it was weird. The sound I noticed most sounded like someone using a belt and slapping it against something with a little bit of force, but not a lot, and the timing between is erratic, but not longer than 3 seconds between each. Not shorter than 1 second. My shift starts at 9. Nothing really weird happened, just the sounds that I heard the day before started to begin around 10. My colleague that has worked there for several years commented on the belt sound and said that he had never heard it before. Now, I begin to feel uneasiness in my body. Just me expecting the worst. The belt sound stopped after 4 to 5 whips. Everything is quiet and sound until 2. That's when I have to give someone their medicine. Just outside the person's apartment, there is an entrance, 10 meters in front of the door to the apartment. The entrance door is made of thick and sturdy glass and metal. Just when I'm going to try and give the person their medicine, I hear a really loud sound from the entrance. It literally sounded like someone ran right into the door. I know how it sounds because every apartment building in the neighborhood has that kind of door as an entrance, and in my drunken adventures I've run into one of them and know exactly what it sounds like. Really didn't pay that much attention to it, started wrapping up and heading out of the apartment and went into the next one to take the trash out. Just as I exit, I hear someone tugging at the door handle with all the might of an angry teenager at the staff toilet door that's right around the corner. I stop dead in my track, and my heart skips a beat. I hastily check the door, and it's open. The goddamn door is open, and I can guarantee on my mother's grave that I closed it 10 minutes earlier. Now I'm scared. I check every door in the whole building, and every door that is supposed to be closed and locked is locked and closed. It's impossible that it was my colleague, since I would have heard the staff sleeping room door open and close since it's right next to the staff toilet. After that, I walked into the staff room and have been sitting here for 2 hours since I'm too scared to move, and I don't want to step 1 foot outside until 5 a.m. Everything that's supposed to be done is done too. Just 3 hours left of this shift. I'm sure I'm going to have bad nightmares. Growing up in a very superstitious family, I was exposed to the paranormal fairly young. At the time of this experience, I was between 4 to 6, and I'm now 15. Like most young children, I had imaginary friends. Now, I don't remember much about the friends, so a lot of the details of them are things that I told my mum, and she later repeated back to me. These friends of mine, one was a boy and the other a girl, were dressed, as I know now, like someone from the early to mid 1800s. The way I described them to my mum was the little boy was wearing a white shirt with buttons, brown pants and straps on his shoulders. The little girl was wearing a long white dress. Neither wore shoes, and their clothes had holes. Like most kids with imaginary friends, I would talk to them as if they were really there. So at first my mum didn't really put much thought into it. Soon enough though, she began to think that there was more to this situation than she first believed. The first thing to set her off was when I started talking about the little boy's father. No big deal, right? Except for the fact that I was absolutely terrified of the boy's father, as far as someone crying to my mum about him, after an incident with my brother seeing an entity attached to me. My mother called our preacher. She had him bless the house and myself, and after that I completely stopped seeing the children. I now have very little memory of them. I don't even remember what their names were, but my mum does. But she will not say them, for fear of reattachment. This takes place in a very small town in western Kentucky. As in one flashing caution light, blink, and you'll miss it. There is a 2-lane highway that runs between this town and a large college town about 15 minutes away. At the time this story takes place, the highway was shut down for a few days for repaving in the very small town. Also, I was 20 years old and 4 months pregnant. I was working in a convenience store that only sold tobacco products and lottery tickets. I normally worked the day shift, but due to another employee's scheduling conflict, I was closing that day by myself. One of my regular customers had left about 5 minutes prior to closing. After I saw him pull out of the parking lot, I walked over to the door to lock it. It's also important to note that there were absolutely no other vehicles besides my own in the parking lot. Before I could turn the lock, 2 armed men, dressed in all black, including full face masks, rushed the door and pushed it open, ordering me back to the register area to empty it, as well as the separate lottery machine and register. I emptied both of these into a plastic bag. The guy carried a shotgun, ordered me to the back room where the safe was, and had me empty this as well. At this point, I began hyperventilating and was trying to cover my pregnant belly with one arm, all the while trying to throw the cash and rolled coins into the bag. The man grew impatient and pushed me backwards into the wall, grabbing the cash that I had dropped. The second man came into the back room, aiming his firearm at me, and shouted at me to stay back there and slammed the door shut while they ran out the front door. I had fallen to the ground after hitting the wall, so when I heard the front door close, I crawled to the door to the back room and cracked it open to be sure they were gone. After confirming this, I ran to the front door, locked it, then ran back to the counter where our phone is. My hands were shaking so badly, I could hardly dial, but managed to call the owner of the store, who called the police. Due to the shut-down highway, it took them about 20 minutes to arrive, along with an ambulance. I gave my statement. The police called in their K9 units to attempt to track the men, since they had obviously fled on foot. But as far as I know, they were never caught. I was in shock, so my boss called my now ex-husband and asked me to come pick me up. There was no way I would be able to drive myself. The jerk was with his friends playing video games and refused. Thankfully, his son was able to drive me home, and I sat in our empty house for 3 hours before he came home. I was jumping at every little sound and was a nervous wreck when he did finally return. Ultimately, I had to go to the hospital because of the stress, causing me to go into early labor. Thankfully, they were able to stop the contractions, and my daughter made her appearance 4 months later. Fun fact: when my daughter was 3, I was speaking about this to her preschool teacher, and she said, "Yeah, I heard the whole thing." It was scary. She's now 12 and insists that she remembers this. My family and I had just moved into a new house. This was right after the housing market went way up in the 2000s. So the house we were moving into was a dump, but it was all we could afford in our school district. You see, it had previously been a crack house. The windows were busted by police, fences taken down by SWAT, needles in the garbage disposal. It was a dump. My mum and stepdad were fixing it up before we finally moved in. My sister's dad would go over after work and paint it, because everything was covered in graffiti. He got home one night and said, "When I got to the house today, I saw a little kid." This was after they had already replaced the windows so nobody could break in. He said that he came into the house and he saw a little kid go from one bedroom into the master. So he went into the master bedroom and no one was there. At first he thought my mum had been there with my sister and had left someone there. When he realized we were not there, he didn't really know what happened. My mum just told him it was fumes and to open up a window and wear a mask. Keep in mind, my stepdad isn't the type of person to believe in ghosts or paranormal things, and he didn't get scared easy, so this wasn't out of character for him. Right after we moved in, almost instantly, my sister had an imaginary friend called Whitehead, and this was unusual because she never played pretend. She never played with dolls or anything, and she was more of a computer Game Boy tech kind of person, and still is today. She was always very logical, and thought very scientifically, even though she was young at the time. It was just odd, because she'd never had an imaginary friend before. My mum and I were always the more artsy, wacky ones. Generally, when a child invents an imaginary friend, it's because they want someone to play with. But her imaginary friend was super annoying, and he was always bothering her. She would constantly complain about him, Mikey not sharing a toy, or wouldn't play this game, or he touched my juice. He's not following rules or taking turns. Who invents such an unobedient imaginary friend who you can fight with all day? One day my mum was out front talking with our neighbours, and she was telling my mum that before these people before us, there was another family with kids. Then she asked if they ever saw anything weird in the house. She told my mum that they had seen stuff in the house, and that her son, who was a teenager, when he was little had an imaginary friend called Mikey. The kids that lived in our house before us also played with him, and she had seen him before. My sister and I would spend our weekends with our grandparents, and my mum would take the batteries out of all our toys because they would keep going off randomly when no one was in. I remember I had a piggy bank that made a noise when you put money in. One night it wouldn't stop, so I checked to see if it was jammed, but nothing was in it. So I ended up throwing it away because it wouldn't stop going off in the middle of the night. I had never had problems with sleeping before or after that house, but when we lived there, every morning I would wake up contorted in some way. I would wake up shoved in a little space between my bed and dresser in a ball, and I would always be stuck, and my mum would have to help me out in the morning. I would always try to figure out how, but never could. I was in 3rd to 4th grade at the time, and my mum had put guards on the side of my bed, but I would still end up contorted and shoved between the dresser. This never happened when I stayed with my grandparents. My mum worked a night job and would stay home during the day with my sister. One night she came home from work and was washing her hands in the kitchen. From the kitchen you could see into the living room. My mum turned around because she could feel someone watching her, and for a split second she saw a kid standing there. She said he looked around 8 years old, and in a flash he was gone. Not too long after, it was my sister's birthday. After the party, my sister and I went to my grandparents' house. My mum and stepdad were alone. My mum took all the balloons from the party and tied them together and put them in the corner of the living room. So they were watching TV. The air was off because the weather is nice, and all of a sudden, all of the balloon strings came together like someone grabbed them, and they floated down about a foot. Then they went around the corner and really slowly down the hallway. Then once they got to the light in the hallway, the balloons went down and around the light. It went down to the end of the hallway and stopped at my sister's door. My mum and stepdad were watching in horror, not knowing what to do. So my mum shouts out, "Hey Mikey, if you want those balloons you can have them." Right when she said that, the balloons went into my sister's room. Now there used to be a Taco Bell by our house. This was before they started remodeling it, so it looked like a mission. My mum, my sister and I were driving past it, and my sister said, "Mikey said that he used to live in a Taco Bell house." We didn't think anything of it. After we'd lived there for a while, my mum decided to look into the history of the property. Before, it had been a cattle ranch. She then learned that before that, right on the property where our house and 3 others were on, there was a children's mission. It was funded by the Catholic Church, and they had orphans. That's when it clicked. One year my sister said, "It's Mikey's birthday. We have to have a cake." So my mum made a cake, and she then marked it with a little dot on the calendar. Then when she changed over the calendar the next year, she marked it with a dot again, just to see. And the following year on the exact same day, my sister says, "It's Mikey's birthday today. He wants a cake." At Christmas time, my mum went out and bought him a Hot Wheel and a little toy horse, and a few days later the horse disappeared. My sister didn't touch it, and I have no idea where it went. A few years later, When we were playing in the backyard, we found it buried in the yard, and we brought it back inside and put it on the coffee table. And that night, it went missing again, and we haven't seen it since. So I was a picky eater, still am, but my stepdad used to make me stay at the table till I ate all my food. I was also stubborn, so I'd sit there till 10 at night when he would finally just let me go to bed. But every night at that table, I would see a shadow walking around the hallway from room to room. I would just think I was seeing things, but it would happen almost every night. That's pretty much everything I remember. My mum, sister and I moved out after my mum and stepdad split up, and I haven't been back there since. My sister's dad still lives there, and she goes out there on weekends. She's in high school now, and she still tells me about the house and how it feels heavy, and how she sees the shadows. I hope that you have found the story somewhat interesting. I was walking along the sidewalk one day and a guy with a windowless van pulls up beside me and said he could give me a bottle of water if I got into his van, as this was summer and a rather hot day. I declined and continued walking, and the guy started shouting and screaming and beating his steering wheel, yelling over and over again, "It's free! How can you say no to free?" I got to where I was going, which was only a few blocks further, and was a gas station, and had a lovely drink there while talking to the cashier, who was a friend, and reported having the exact same situation happen to her. By chance I was still there, late that evening, when the shift changed and the incoming cashier reported strange windowless vans idling in the back corner of the lot out of the light. "Call the police," was what I felt like saying, but as it happened, a rather sizable dude was in the area. He overheard us swapping stories and announced he was going to take care of it. I don't know what happened. None of us three ever saw the van again. Or the big guy, for that matter. When I was little, I used to have an imaginary friend named George who lived in my house with me. Of course, my parents shrugged it off, because what kind of toddler doesn't have an imaginary friend at some point? One day me and George were playing, and all of a sudden I started choking badly. My parents come rushing into the room freaking out, thinking I'm choking on something. But as soon as they walk in, I stop. I'm struggling for breath and crying, and I tell them that George was angry, and that I would not do something he wanted. I can't remember what it was. But ever since that day, George was no longer a part of my life. Me being 24 now, I don't really scare that easy from paranormal type stuff. But it seems to always happen. Not too long ago, I was watching some ghostly show on TV. No one was home, and out of nowhere, the dustpan literally flew off the dryer in the room on the other side of the house and landed 10 feet away from where I was originally sitting. Now, I've seen stuff throughout my life, and I also deal with sleep paralysis from time to time. But a big part of me wonders if George is still lurking around and is just salty that I don't speak with him anymore. My grandma knows about George, but no one's ever told her about him. What do you guys think?